Well, there's certainly a level of that, but some of the stuff. Now, I can't confirm or deny some things that they've got in this video that they haven't cited where they got the translations from. From my cursory looking, seem to be from Goodreads.com and the quote section on Goodreads.com. That would be, I don't know for sure if that's where they got them, but that does seem to be a popular site that has these exact quotes on them, which these quotes are dubious in quality, and the sources for them, one has a source for it, but it's wrong. It's incorrect. It's got the wrong year. The translation on it is... I'll get to it later. I think we're ready to start.
Uproar in the Studio was published by Great Wall Film Company and was produced by the four Wan brothers, Wan Lai-ming, Wan Guchang, Wan Chao-chen, and Wan Di-huan, of which Wan Lai-ming is widely recognized as being the father of Chinese animation. The vision of the Wan brothers was simple. They wanted to produce quality animations but with a distinctly Chinese animation style. And to that end, the brothers continued to hone their craft until they released their magnum opus in 1941, right in the middle of World War II. Princess Iron Fan, the first Asian animated feature film.
This is kind of
That's
a big
right.
deal film,
Before Japan
which
had
we'll get
ever
into later.
released an animated feature film, the Chinese film industry, even while suffering
When they
under
say
the terrible
that,
conditions
I
of
think he
World
means
War II,
theatrically
was
produced,
developing
because they
enough to
have
produce
released
a
a lot of
73-minute
short
animated
films
film
from that point.
directed and produced by two of the Wan brothers, Wan Guchang and Wan Lai-ming. The story of Princess Iron Fan is a sort of reimagining of a short scene in the famous Chinese novel Journey to the West, in which the Monkey King, Sun Wukong, must persuade Princess Iron Fan to allow them to borrow her
Like I said,
fan
most of
so
the
that
stuff
they
seems to
can
be from
cross the mountain
a
of flame.
chapter book he got
And as
through,
you
and
can
it
see, the
seems
animation
fine.
is
It's
surprisingly
mostly just a
sophisticated,
summary of
with
some of the events.
characteristics that we'd later see emerge in animation industries across East and even Southeast Asia. Princess Iron Fan was a
maybe
monumental achievement in
not.
Asian animation, but it was also
Some
something of an
elements.
effective
Some
propaganda
elements.
piece. The underlying message was, if you keep persevering, if you work together, you can walk even through fire and rid the world of
This
calamity.
Iron Fan was
It
a very
powerful message
important
of endurance
Chinese
and
animated
unity
movie because
that
it is
resonated across
colour
Asia, being ravaged by
animated
the
movie,
Japanese
theatrical length
Empire.
in the
Indeed,
40s
it was
in
the
Asia.
success and achievement of Princess Iron Fan, both as a work of art, but also as a work of propaganda, that first led the Japanese government to invest its own resources in Japan's homegrown animation industry, which resulted in the release of the propaganda film Momotaro no Umiwashi, or Momotaro's Sea Eagles, in 1943.
Yes,
Momotaro's Sea Eagles is literally a
that
dramatization of the attack on
is
Pearl Harbor, in which
mostly
Japanese
true,
children's
yeah.
folk hero Momotaro leads a naval air
There is-
squadron and bombs the island of...
There is some interesting facts around that in terms of... So one thing you could bring up here is that the industry in Japan, the reason that Iron Fan became kind of a deal in Japan is that, like, at that point, the Japanese animation industry was a very handcrafted kind of industry, which was not respected at all by the government or parties. And a lot of it was commercial work in terms of, like, educational animation, some short films. There are people who are, like, hobbyists who would make their own short films. There was no, like, infrastructure in place quite yet to be making big movies. And when there was here, I guess it was more of a government push. But the advantageousness of this push comes with the side effect that a lot of the animators who are in Japan, who are in that sort of precarious position during the war, they were sort of brought onto these projects, not necessarily because of their politics. Usually they had opposite opinions than the government did, and that's put them in a lot of dangerous positions in the last 10 years of the government as they got stronger and stronger on censorship. Some of them were getting, like, literally kidnapped and imprisoned and tortured for some of the animated shorts they made. But what they effectively said is that, you know, if you make these animated films for us, you won't get drafted, which was quite enticing for the people, like, who didn't want to die in the war.
Onigashima.
I don't know if I actually have... I mean, I actually have the next movie over here behind me.
Japan's first ever feature-length animated film, Momotaro's Sacred Sailors,
Sacred Sailors,
was
yes.
released in 1945, a full 4 years after Princess Iron Fan.
I think it's like 80 minutes.
In this film, Momotaro leads the conquest of a primitive island of talking animals and
It's
purges them of their savagery by
not
teaching
particularly
them
very good
Japanese
film.
before
I'm going to
then
be honest, I've seen it
proceeding to
myself.
liberate
I have it
the
behind
island
me.
of Celebes from the British. The modern discourse surrounding these
Right here?
films is that they were never intended to be propaganda.
Okay,
by the
okay.
Japanese
I'm sorry.
government.
This is
Why?
this
These
is
are
wrong.
films for
This is just
children,
wrong. This
which
is
is,
just
of course,
absolute. Well, I don't know what he's yapping about here. I heard this for the first time. Like, that's not true. Where's he got this from? Who was saying that the movie about bombing Pearl Harbor is not supposed to be propaganda? You'd have to be the most weaselly, cowardly nationalist to ever make such a like an opinionated statement. It's just like these movies are so based around the war and Japan being better at war than other places, and this idea of like taking out people like some of the characters are even like drawn to be like Popeye and other like British figures. Like there's a part in the movie here of this Momotaro, you know, Sacred Sailors, where they like scare off all the British imperialists, and they all like run away. I'm pretty sure that's in this one. And it's like, bro, how could you pretend this isn't propaganda? You'd have to be, I don't know if this person exists. I don't know if this is someone he saw on Twitter or something, but you would just have to be such a coward not to accept the premise of this as a propaganda film. It would like America not accepting that like those propaganda Disney cartoons exist or something. We all know it is what it is. Like we could talk about how serious it is, but like you gotta, I just don't think these people exist. And bro loves using pictures of fucking, you know, rest in peace, Mr. Rip Bozo over here. Fucking, oh, I've forgotten his name now. Fuck, how have I forgotten his name? I always know this fucking cunt. Oh my god. He's been dead for years. He hasn't been president for like, well, prime minister even for like 5 years. My god, people need to move on. Abe. Fucking Abe he's not relevant. Who directed it? His name is Mitsuyo Seo, I think his name is. He is the director. He was a Marxist. I think he's a Trotskyist. He used to make like, in the 30s, he used to make propaganda cartoons about, I think it was Soviet Russia and like, you know, these were like subtle propaganda cartoons about communism basically that he was making back in the 30s. And then he got beaten up by the state for releasing them and they tortured him for about a month. And eventually he's here. He was a big fan of Iron Fan, though. Yeah, so this is what happened here. In the previous video, Moon Channel posited that the creator of Momotaro was a rapid, like, ultra-nationalist, which was just not fundamentally untrue. That's just fundamentally not reality. He was definitely like a Trotskyist Marxist who was beaten up by the state and ultimately took the decision so he didn't get drafted. Someone who generally regrets making those movies in retrospect, but I guess in the position he was, there wasn't really much options. It was either die in the war or make cartoons for the government. And I think he was inspired on some degree to make a big feature. He'd never had the choice, never had the chance, never had the financial position to make a theatrical movie of such scale before, especially, you know, and post seeing Iron Fan, I think he was really like quite blown away that like, oh, this is something you can actually do in Asia, it's possible. Yeah, I mean, maybe. I mean, I think it's just like it's hard to have principles during the time of like famine and war and, you know, against crushing opposition to the point where he couldn't physically make any other movie any other way anymore. It's a difficult position to be in, but they may well have tortured his beliefs out of him, you know, through an extended time period. It's definitely possible at the time. But yeah, because he used to do showings of his films. I think it was the Tokyo area. It's in this booklet. So this movie here, the reason I bought this is it comes with, I won't get too much into it today. It comes with a fat little book here. This is a book about his life and the period of making this movie and the history of Japanese animation during the 40s. So there's a lot of crazy stories in here. But this is like 100+ pages of just like stuff, and there's some crazy stories in there. But hence why I instantly, when I start hearing Moon talk about this content, sometimes I'm a bit like, I don't know about that.
Atrocity.
Yeah, so this statement is just ludicrous as a setup.
In any country, Japan notwithstanding. These films were ordered and funded by the
Yes,
Japanese
no
Naval
one would deny
Ministry
that.
to make the Japanese Navy look good.
I don't think it's possible to deny these positions, considering what's in the movie.
Momotaro is bombing Pearl
He's
Harbor
bombing
and
Pearl Harbor.
culturally eradicating and
He's
enslaving Pacific
taking
Islanders
British-
for forced labor.
Yeah, and he
both
like
are portrayed
gets the
as
British to leave the
wholesome and
island. He's like,
worthwhile
they war
endeavors.
off them, they scare them off.
Looking past all the propaganda for a moment, though, something curious has happened here. The Momotaro films were heavily inspired by Princess Iron Fan. Everything from the animation style to the propaganda-tinged story to the desire to create said movies came in part from Princess Iron Fan.
To some degree, I mean, it wasn't rotoscoped. That's the real key difference.
Chinese
specifically at that time, was incredibly rotoscoped, which Japan did not use.
Its narrative tropes, techniques, and even its ideological framing were influenced by a Chinese film steeped in Chinese national identity. If you're interested in this topic specifically, by the way, I direct you towards Professor Daisy Yandu's book, An Animated Wartime Encounter, Princess Iron Fan and the Chinese Connection in Early Japanese Animation, an intro snippet of which I've linked for you in the description. The takeaway here is that anime from its roots to its canopy is not an exclusively Japanese product. It's a hybrid, a dynamic interplay between Chinese and Japanese culture and a broad array of external influences. Chinese folklore, Chinese animation techniques, wartime propaganda, and Western narrative structures, to name a few.
Yes and no. It's to some degree, like I said, the animation techniques in China were different. I think he's put a couple asterisks on there, but to say the beginning is Chinese is maybe a bit partially true, but maybe maybe he's right actually. Maybe Chairman Mao made anime actually. Maybe I actually agree now. No, maybe he's gone to something here actually. I don't know. Maybe. Yeah, maybe Tezuka was also. I mean, apparently he was a big fan of the movie too. Maybe. I don't know. Maybe I should be thanking Mao for anime. Maybe we should be Xi Mao. Maybe we should all be thanking Chairman Mao for anime. Actually, maybe we should. Xi Mao. Thank you. But there's a lot to this. It's a little bit more complicated than that. I mean, apparently China is now anime, so we can go with that, I guess. So what will happen here in a second?
This fusion that anime as we know it emerged.
Anime
evolved from a tool of state messaging into a deeply personal art.
This is the problem here. Is there's a little gap here.
Intensity. Even in its most surreal or fantastical genres, anime has an uncanny ability to touch us.
We can't. This is something he did in his other video. We can't go from 1945 all the way to anime and pretend that there was no intermission period or there wasn't a transition or there wasn't things that happened after that. We can definitely say Iron Fan was an influence on. It was an influence on Tezuka. It was certainly an influence on some of the early Toei animators, but the early Toei animators had a variety of influences from French animation to Soviet animation to American animation to some degree. They were learning some stuff from old American animation books that they'd found basically. So there was a variety of influence in this industry. And I think that Iron Fan philosophically is probably more of an influence than it is technically, because like I said, rotoscope is not really a big thing in the anime industry, because to do the kind of rotoscope that China was doing, you would need to have a lot of reference people, you'd have to have the cameras, you need to have at least 8. God, what would you need back then? Maybe a 60mm camera. You're going to need people to do the referencing, or you could at least need somebody. There's a lot of process to do rotoscoping back then, right? And Japan didn't have that infrastructure per se in position. So the way they approached animation was different, but I think it was more of a philosophical inspiration and the ambition that I think got them, as well as some of the, like you said, I mean, some of that's fine. Do we have 8mm back in fucking 1945? I'm not even sure. I know we had 30, but were people using, because Super 8 is kind of commercial stuff. Maybe they had 8mm back then. I'm not even sure when we started using 8mm. If you can use it, I guess. I mean, they were using it in the 60s, but I don't know if they were using it in the 40s. You might be able to find Iron Fan on China and on China at Mao's grave, maybe. No, you'll probably find it on Bilibili. And you'll probably find a rip of it on YouTube, which might not be the best quality, but it's probably going to be there probably will be a full rip of Iron Fan on YouTube that you could just find. I bet you. It might not be the best quality though. Yeah, 35mm is expensive though, so I don't know if you'd want to waste that on rotoscoping. I mean, I guess you'd have to, but I don't know. It's up to you on that one. The Chinese need to take lessons from Fleischer. I mean, they might have. They might have looked at that stuff at the time. I think that was definitely an influence in the area. So, let's get to, where are we now? Where's the video at? In a moment, I'm going to be skipping because we will be through the first anime section.
Fluently in the languages of such difficult feelings as longing, alienation, nostalgia, frustration, and
we just jumped
there can be a disarming
from 1945 to 1962, and now we're at fucking 2010.
More ironic or sanitized, brand-safe tones of mainstream Western
So
animation
a lot of things happened in that period. A lot of changes, a lot of adjustments.
Emerged by accident, though. It was shaped by the rapid modernization and rebuilding, by the cultural soul-searching that occurred during Japan's post-war.
Kind of, yeah, in some ways. I mean, I think that you could say that about everything, right? That there was...
I would like to make a film to tell children it's good to be alive.
I don't know if I checked what that quote was in terms of Miyazaki. It seemed fairly, like, I wasn't going to contest it.
World War II was a time of great cultural upheaval for Japan,
yeah,
which resulted
this
in a new
bit
imperial Japanese...
is like the... I'm going to take you through Wikipedia history again a little bit, so I don't think it's really relevant for what I'm going to be going on about here. You found Iron Fan on YouTube, eh? But in black and white. I think it's supposed to be in colour, the original version. Maybe it's on the internetarchive.com. There might be like a Chinese archive of film somewhere. I haven't looked myself, but it's got to be somewhere. Because Momotaro was shot on black and white, but it seems like Iron Fan was shot on colour, I'm pretty sure. So, you know, we'll see from there.
A mass-produced toy.
But while American animation was shrinking in scope and ambition, something very different was happening across the Pacific. As American animation turned increasingly towards commercialization, towards merchandising, simplified storytelling, towards mass production,
I mean, this also happened in Japan.
Was moving in a completely different direction. In the rubble of post-war Japan, where national identity and personal meaningfulness had been destroyed and rebuilt in a foreign image, it was not enough for art to merely entertain. By the end of World War II, much of the infrastructure required to produce, publish, and distribute animated films had been destroyed, as had much of Japanese industry in general. But this same destruction fueled a massive cultural appetite for escapism and meaning, which in turn created opportunities for artists.
No, I think
literature industries grew first, and they were followed.
Has anyone in the chat seen the man carrying things video, which is like, I'm going to make a video about why SpongeBob is pretty good, and he goes, part 1, early cinema. This is what he's doing. This is what he's doing. None of this is really that relevant to the gacha culture, which we could probably start, you know, when gacha got big. Maybe we'll push back to some concepts forward, but like none of this is really. It's nothing to do with a gacha game, really. We're not even talking about like pre-gacha or like with those fucking gachapon machines or so. None of this is. This is a completely different topic, frankly. But whatever.
By animation and film. The post-war era also saw American culture flood into Japan, and that included works of American animation like the aforementioned Disney films. Japanese animators and artists saw and became inspired by the vibrant and fully colored animations of Walt Disney and the highly stylized works of Max Fleischer.
The parts I'm skipping are not relevant to the topic at hand, what we're talking about. They're completely on different subjects. Like, I'm here to talk about soft power and anime. I'm not here to talk about the gacha part. There are lots of different subjects in this video which are completely different topics. That's why I'm kind of skipping over them. I have no interest in talking about, a history recap. This is still part of the history recap, really, so maybe I don't even know if this is worth getting into too much for a bit, but I'll let it play for a while. But, like, we're talking about the thesis of parts that are brought up here, and rather about, I'm not going to make an argument about gacha here.
And Japanese soul-searching, where a crucial figure steps into the story, the so-called father of anime.
There are lots of chapters in the video, but I've downloaded it here.
Osamu Tezuka.
Maybe I should start here with the Tezuka part, to be honest. It might be better to start here, because I think I was trying to get to the Tezuka chapter. Here's the Tezuka chapter.
Soft power, I think
that's where I actually wanted to go.
That my audience already knew about Tezuka's outsized influence on anime, and thus elected to cut out a large section on him.
Now, the reason he's saying this is that he was accused in his comment section of basically painting Tezuka as a rapid nationalist who cried at the creation of Momotaro. Bear in mind, he was about 16 when it came out. And that inspired his entire career as a mangaka and his animation aspirations, which he's going to downplay now, and he's going to bring in some stuff which is a bit more appropriate, let's say. but he might also say some stuff which is not true. So I've probably wanted to get directly to this section, so let's go from here.
But I think for the purposes of this video, a discussion of Tezuka is absolutely essential. Tezuka was born in 1928, in the first few years of the Showa era, and he bore witness to all of the modernization, growing militarism,
Again,
and cultural
I don't know if
flux
this is
of that
too
period.
relevant to his broader
1928 was
topic
also the year
to be
Steamboat Willie,
going
Mickey
through
Mouse's
every little
first
part of,
cartoon,
well, not every
debuted,
part, but
which
just these
incorporated
parts of Tezuka's life,
synchronized music
100%,
into
but
animation for the first
if he
time.
feels like he's forgotten
As
to do it
such,
last time.
Just as Tezuka witnessed Japan changing before his very eyes, he also witnessed the early years of the animation industry and the achievements made during that time. When Tezuka was a boy, his father took him to see Disney movies, and he developed a deep love for Disney. For example, Tezuka claims to have seen Bambi over 80 times. Disney, ostensibly, is where Tezuka borrowed the now iconic large anime eyes.
No, that's not true. That's not true at all. That's not true at all. That's completely false. No. So, let's go into this topic. This is a lie that's been told for, oh god, how long is it? How long people have been saying this stuff? 55 years now, maybe? God almighty, something like that. This is just not true. The reason this is not true is multifaceted. So first thing we could do is that this is just like one of those like things that people say that they you know, it's like, that has to be true. I heard it and everyone says it's true. But it's just not true. And we could go back to some of the basic things. I have some really basic, you know, things that you could find without much trouble. Some of them are a little bit more complicated, but let's just get into my collection of images here. So first things first. So let's go back to the 20s. I'm gonna do his thing right now. We're gonna go all the way back to the 20s for a second. In the 20s, there was a craze of women's magazines and manga where big eyes were all the rage in Japan. As you can see, pretty big eyes here. Tezuka didn't create big eyes in animation. That would be absurd. And he didn't just get it from like looking at, oh, I've never seen that before. Disney, I should do that. That's not what happened. There was already a culture of these kind of ideas that existed within the world that Tezuka lived in. He might not credit that, but sometimes people would argue that maybe that's because Tezuka liked to look a little bit more cosmopolitan about where his influences came, because it makes him feel maybe a little bit fancier or something along those lines. And he obviously had an aspiration towards, like, he liked American comics and other stuff. He was very international. The key point about Tezuka, he was a rich kid. The reason he could see these films so many times is he allegedly had a home projector at home, and he could watch like animations in his house. So he could get the canisters and then watch them in his own home theatre. That was very rare that someone could do that. And that is a position that Tezuka was in to do. So his influence to be able to see other films, and he also got to see a lot of them in the cinema as well. So he had a privilege that a lot of kids probably didn't have, that he could see all these different things from all over the place and even read American comics here and there. He was all over, right? Is it a girls' magazine? I'm not sure if this one's manga. I'm trying to remember where I got this one from. It was a little while ago. I wrote some stuff about it before. I think it's a specific fashion magazine back in the day, if I remember right. But again, my memory's getting a bit blurry about it. It's too fucking warm. I wrote some down on a Twitter thread years ago about this, but my memories are fraying together a little bit on that one. I want to say it was a fashion magazine, but these were generally art movements at the time that Tezuka was growing up. So, like, secondary. Secondary is not going to be mentioned in this video, but let's get into a different area called Red Book, or Akahon, I think in Japanese. This is a topic that's not really talked about in English very much, but this was kind of the area which Tezuka starts his career. Now, Red Hon have a lot of different kind of visual styles, visual techniques within the work that they do in that area. Here is a selection of Red Books. These came out around Tezuka's period working on them, and if you look at that, wow, we've got some pretty big eyes actually. There's some pretty big eye images in these Red Books, which some of these predate Tezuka, or they were around at the same time as he was working in that field. So it was not uncommon to see these things. It's just that, like, when people talk about this, they're talking about it from a very limited scope of knowledge. So they just assume that's the case, but it's just not. Okay. Here are more Red Books. Pretty big eyes, as we can see here. Those are those again. Some of these will predate Tezuka. I believe there's some stuff that even predate this by about 20 years. But I will bring up specifically. There's a quote from a New Type magazine from 2003. This is U.S. New Type magazine. This is a Fred Patton article from that time period where he asked someone who worked with Tezuka back in the 60s on the American run. So yeah, New Type USA 2003 November issue. At an event panel for the history of anime a couple months ago, from the 1960s American TV producer Fred Ladd, who met Osamu Tezuka many occasions, said that originally assumed Tezuka's big eyes, this is probably where the convention came from, traditions, because he was a big fan of Disney in the 30s and 40s and their cartoon style. But when he mentioned it to Tezuka, the latter said no, he was actually imitating Betty Boop. Tezuka was a big Disney fan, and other aspects of his work were inspired by Disney animation and even Disney comic books and newspaper strips. That's very true. I've got an article in my source document about that. But the big eyes are thanks to Fleischer's studio. And again, you could even argue that's a little bit So again, we could argue that Tezuka may be bullshitting a little bit when he's talking about it being from Fleischer and that he wants to look a bit more cosmopolitan. Because again, this is like, we can see in the Red Book, there are even comics that go far back there, which also have pretty big eyes. They were probably Fleischer inspired too, to be fair. They have a very Fleischer tinge to them. But like, it was not like we got all the way to 1950 and then suddenly people were like, damn, big eyes, I'd never thought about that before. It was a common occurrence. It's just like Tezuka had a particular style that the Americans were like quite thought were novel. It was like, oh, look at the big eyes. That's like an American perspective. But again, that's where we're talking, where this kind of opinion only can come from you like using this sort of assumption of knowledge, being like, everybody knows that's true. Where like, if you looked it up, if you looked at anything relating to that topic, you're probably going to find a different answer. Anyway, I'll keep going.
Alone, but because Tezuka believed that the eyes were the window to the soul, that the larger eyes could be used to create deeper empathy with his audience. Now, despite Tezuka's love for Disney, it was not Disney films that most inspired Tezuka's passion for animation. As per Daisy Yu's an animated wartime encounter was none other than Princess Iron Fan.
So this is probably more correct. I mean, he had a lot of influences though, lots of different varieties.
To become an animator. From Princess Iron Fan, Tezuka took away that unique style.
Tezuka wasn't necessarily an animator by trade. I think he did a little bit of animation in the 70s, because he started making more movies at that point, some things that were a bit more experimental. But generally, he created animation, but not animating it himself. He was the producer, more so. I think that's important to set down. He was not an animator by trade.
Style of Chinese storytelling that the Wan brothers put into their
He did like a lot of Chinese tales, like Johnny the West.
As a backdrop to tell his story with a lesson. But he also took away the fact that animation needn't be funny or childish. Animation could carry the weight of an epic narrative, and animation needn't be exclusively Western. There was indeed a way to create animation within the East Asian cultural context. During the war, when Tezuka was still a teenager, he was drafted to work in a factory to support the war effort. He saw the cold ruthlessness of war and how it stripped the dreams away from people at home, even as it took the lives of innocents abroad. He watched Japanese wartime animated propaganda like the Momotaro.
Generally, Tezuka was considered pretty anti-war in his career. He was very anti-Vietnam War as well.
Convey a message of propaganda, and he thought he could also use that same power to convey other messages of responsibility, caring, and compassion. Then after the war, Tezuka did something that'll sound very familiar to many a good Asian amongst us. He got accepted into Osaka University and began studying medicine. Yet in his heart, he was first and foremost an artist. At the age of 17, in the year 1945, Tezuka published his first professional work, Diary of Ma-chan, where already his distinctive style
I'm
and
pretty
empathetic
sure
writing could be seen.
were Red
While in medical
books,
school, Tezuka published
because
several other
Treasure
manga
Island was
series,
also a
including
Red
few
book.
different minor works in 1947.
I think there is a
Lost World in
transition,
1948, Metropolis in 1949,
but a lot of these I
and
think
Next World in
started as Red books. I think when we get to the later
each of
50s
which
though,
were
he
science
transitions
fiction
to a more
novels
manga
with fantastical
publication.
worlds. These kinds of works weren't just
Red books kind of, from my knowledge of them, the Red books were kind of more like children's books, and they were very like pulp, disposable pulp. Manga, I guess, it's a slightly different field, but like I think it had different formats, I suppose, different ways of setting things up, probably different print styles as well. But I think Red books start to die out and manga starts rising. It's basically the change.
exercises in world building, though. They were early experiments in the kinds of questions that would define Tezuka's entire career. What is the cost of progress? Can humanity live in harmony with technology? And what does it mean to be human? Thereafter, Tezuka published his first major hit, a manga you might be familiar with called Kimba the White Lion, known in Japan as Janguru Taite. Kimba was, on its surface, a children's story about a lion cub destined to rule the jungle. But just beneath that surface, just a little deeper, there were themes of environmentalism, inherited trauma, the moral responsibilities of leadership, and the challenge of building peace in a world that is shaped by violence. They were all issues that echoed Japan's post-war anxieties and contributed to the national discourse around Japan's identity, moral responsibility, and future. Kimba, though iconic, would
Toei,
not prove
no,
to be Tezuka's
Kimba
most
was
enduring work.
Mushi
In
Productions.
1951, Tezuka published the manga Ambassador Adam, and though
Most of this
Ambassador
is
Adam
like
was only
your
a
fare
modest
of like this is your
success,
early
the
Tezuka
series
history, right?
introduced a character who would soon become a cornerstone of anime history. A humanoid robot boy named Adam, whom Tezuka would spin off into his own story, Tetsuwan Atomu, known in the West as Astro Boy. And what made Astro Boy so enduring, so
Konami.
monumental, was
Damn.
not just its futuristic setting or action-packed sequences, but the powerful emotional core at its center. Astro Boy was a
the
story
manga
about
of
the definition of life, a story
Astro
about
Boy is pretty
father-son
crazy.
estrangement, about
Goes very
discrimination,
quickly, a lot
and
of
about
random
the
shit
search for
happens.
humanity in an
It's pretty
increasingly
intense in that way.
mechanized world. In just the intro, Astro Boy
And
beats
fairly
up the
popular.
clan and fights the
But now,
beggars
yeah, we
who
get
are
into the
wearing a
animation. It's
suspiciously
slightly
similar
different
outfit to
in
the
some
clan.
ways.
I'm joking, of course, but only sort of. None of these were incidental themes. They reflected the anxieties of post-war Japan, much in the same way that Superman once embodied the idealism and fears of America during its own post-war soul-searching.
You've got to agree to stop your attacks on us and your...
When I say he implied that Tezuka was a warmonger, he did that in the last video. The video called, what was it, Kawaii Gets You Away with War Crimes or something like that. That was not in this video. You're Not Immune to Propaganda video he made. That's where the implication is a bit more worrying. I think this video's version of Tezuka is fairly reasonable. Outside of getting some key points of his history wrong, I suppose he'd say broadly those things don't matter in the general position of teaching your audience about Tezuka. I mean, he kind of mentioned some parts of... I guess it depends. I don't think Tezuka is super relevant to the topic, I suppose, at hand, but unless we're just talking about, in general, the history of animation and soft power, which about half this video is about, even though it's not super relevant to the topic of Gacha. Yeah, I mean, Superman has been a lot of things for different reasons. He, generally towards the 50, became a bit more, all-American good, racism bad, equality and all that, when he wasn't a propagandist himself. When he was, doing some strange stuff in the 40s, but such is the evolving times of characters like these, which are always evolving with the context of the industry they're in.
Nation was founded by foreigners and built by foreigners. Everyone here either came from another country or is descended from folks who did.
Let's see.
Don't you ever
I need
read
to
your
just double
history,
check where I am on my script,
you stupid bigot?
because I may need to start moving in a moment.
It's a shame that we're still relearning lessons from the 40s here in the United States, but that's a different video for a different day. But back to Tezuka, he was not content with merely telling stories on paper. He believed in the power of moving pictures and wanted to reach a broader audience. He wanted to create animation that was not merely a spectacle, but a vessel for empathy and reflection. And so, in the early 1960s, Tezuka took a major risk and founded Mushi Production, an animation studio that forever altered the...
There are some interesting side effects of that. I mean, some of that comes further. He originally started working with Toei, and he didn't enjoy his time with Toei. From his perspective, he felt they were limiting his creative ideas, and there were some disagreements there. Thus, Tezuka thought he could compete on his own level, but he was very naive about his approach, which led to some splintering later on we'll get to.
Japanese animation. For you see, around the same time that American studios like Hanna-Barbera were shifting from cinematic animation
It's supposed to be with a
television,
Z,
producing
Tezuka.
cost-efficient shows like The
But
Flintstones.
the subtitles here, I think these are supposed to be the proper captions. Don't seem to always be following those rules, I guess.
On a shoestring budget. To that end, Tezuka turned to a technique called limited animation. But unlike his American counterparts who used it mainly to churn out cheap cartoons, Tezuka reimagined limited animation as a tool for storytelling. He essentially
I think it was
industrialized the
more
process
so
by breaking down
the process
animation
of which
into
he had to
production
use
roles
to
and
make the
codifying
cartoons
shortcuts like
in
holding on
any
still
way.
frames while animating only the mouth and eyes.
But like these
Rather
these
than
images
treating
obviously don't
limited
represent that,
animation
because
as
this
a
stuff is from the
clumsy
80s,
workaround,
Tezuka.
Tezuka transformed it into a complete production.
It looks to me, anyway. This version of Astro Boy on the screen, this is from the 1980 version, the Tezuka Productions version of Astro Boy, which is obviously quite different from the 1963 version.
philosophy, a philosophy that prioritized storytelling and emotional resonance over expensive.
So this is basically like
emotion
pretty well
or
animated,
crude humor.
all things
In
considered.
so doing, Tezuka
I don't know if it's
established
full
the
animation, but it's
iconic
pretty
visual
decent.
language of anime that is still prevalent.
It's probably
to
more
this
so than
very
his
day.
original cartoons
What
by a
began
bit.
as a necessity born of budgetary limits became a creative strength. Constraints, after all, often fuel innovation, and it was the constraints of television production that pushed Tezuka, Mushi Productions, and the entire
Yeah, I mean, it was mainly Mushi Productions, because again, Tezuka was the producer. He wasn't actually the person making the forefront of things like Rentaro or Dasaki or Tomino, etc., etc. The different people who were running the studio, the animators, etc. They had to make the decisions in the end. Tezuka brought up some of the concepts at first, but ultimately the animators are the ones that had made the decisions. I think he was slightly more involved in some of the movies they made, but that came to a pretty bad conclusion towards the end of that, in terms of the animators and Tezuka kind of went their separate ways.
Generation that followed to rely on other tools to tell their stories, to lean into a unique emotional
The
grammar, which they
Mushi
used
Pro
to craft
staff
stories that
made a
were
union,
culturally resonant
and there was a fight.
distinctly Japanese.
Now, where are we now?
Tezuka didn't exist in a vacuum. The animation and
34.
publishing industries were already on the rise independent of Tezuka, and Japanese cinema was entering its own creative golden age. Yet even amidst this flourishing cultural landscape, Tezuka's contributions to anime were foundational, not just in form or technique, but in feeling, in vibes. The
But they certainly changed the
vocabulary
landscape,
that
because
Tezuka
TV animation
and
didn't
the
exist yet,
pioneers
for sure.
introduced made it possible to tell stories rich with vulnerability and introspection. And yet, even as anime and manga opened
Though,
new
of course,
doors for emotional
it's not to say
exploration, they
that
inherited the
Toei Animation's
contradictions of
work
the society that
was not
birthed them.
also doing a lot of
Or
this
to be
stuff
fair,
too. There's a lot
the
of effective stuff done at Toei
contradictions
Animation
forced upon the society
before
that
and
birthed
during.
them. Tezuka was a
in terms of his
pioneer and
movies.
artist, but he was also a businessman. Astro Boy was not only a revolutionary leap forward for anime as an art form, it was also a revolutionary leap forward for anime as a business.
Yeah, it's definitely for a business. As an art form, it changed the system. But I don't know if it's fair to say it was a revolutionary. In a certain way, it is. But like the Mushi Pro that came after Astro Boy is probably the more interesting Mushi Pro. In fact, the Mushi Pro that splits from Tezuka's work as source material during 1970 goes in to do radically different things in terms of basically creating the language which anime became. You know, things like Ashin no Joe. But especially we could look at Dororo as an interesting experiment too. Like some of those like later 60s work at Mushi Pro were really trying to push the envelope of what they could do. But, you know, things like Ashin no Joe and Belladonna of Sadness really do define anime culture in such a strong way, especially Joe.
The so-called first anime boom, which started with Astro Boy in the 1960s, introduced the Astro Boy business model, where a show might be made and broadcast at a financial loss while profiting off of sponsorship and licensing deals. A sponsor's products might even directly appear in the anime itself.
Yeah, generally this
early
is how it
form of
goes for
product
most
placement.
anime.
And
Now,
while this still happens today in anime, it became less and less.
though I believe that the main sponsor of Astro Boy is actually a candy company over necessarily this, but they probably had multiple deals going on.
Important for the anime industry, as we'll soon see. This business model of subsidizing production through external sponsorship remained dominant into the late 70s.
I'm assuming that's
during
not
what is
actually the
called
anime
second
that, I'm
anime
assuming
boom.
this is an
It was
advert.
during the second anime boom that we saw shows like Space Battleship Yamato and Mobile Suit Gundam. Anime was no longer just
Sure.
promoting other companies'
I'd
products.
say that's
Anime
fairly
itself
neutral
became
position.
the product. Instead of embedding advertisements for chocolate bars or soft drinks, shows like Gundam and Yamato partnered with toy companies to sell model kits, action figures, posters, and soundtracks.
Later.
In other words, instead of
The
being
model
paid
kit revolution's more of like a not late, but it's kind of like an early 80s thing, because I don't think the boat Yamato actually got a full proper boat until after the series was completed, for a myriad of reasons.
to advertise someone else's goods with your show becomes an engine to sell your own merchandise. But the path that anime took to merchandising and commercialization was quite different and arguably more effective than the path that Western animation took.
Yeah,
You
they're
might
big on
already be
model
able to
kits,
see
but the
where
model
this is
kit
going.
boom
If
is
you
like a
profit more from
post-80s
selling
thing.
Toys, posters, and body pillows, and from the show itself, then it is in your interest to cultivate the kind of audience that will buy these things. You lean into what makes your product appealing to begin with. It is in your interest to deepen emotional attachment, to create characters that are not just memorable, but desirable, collectible, and ownable.
I mean, that is definitely
Thus,
the
by
mecha
mid-80s
sort
and
of
on to the 90s,
approach
anime
to
catered
some
increasingly to a
degree,
growing population of
but
otaku,
we'll-
hardcore anime fans whose consumption wasn't just casual.
Oh, fucking hell, what's going on here? Oh, I need to plug in my laptop. So, again, he's a little bit out of step with the history. Like, this is a very short form version of, like, maybe an anime history of the book. But the thing about the 90s being that change, that's not true. The change was the 80s. Like, you can see that defining change with the OVA era, especially, towards, like, 83, 84, 85. That's where you start seeing that change there. You can even see it in Animage, which starts in 1973. But then registering that change in their numbers, in their interests, you could look at that from about 1972 onwards, 71, 72. They noticed that the people who read anime magazines, like Animage, had different tastes and different interests than the broader population, and that they were wondering, they seem to have very specific tastes that don't align themselves with the broader public. How can we take advantage of that from an advertising perspective? And that's when you get into that conversation. So the 90s is already like deep into that sort of spiral. Right. And I think, where's my...
entertainment, but identity defining. The word otaku is an honorific that vaguely translates into a second-person you, and it was first used to categorize hardcore anime fans in 1983 by Akio Nakamori.
No. His history of otaku is very limited, but the otaku as a phrase predates him using it. It was first a term used by otaku to talk about themselves. It was a tongue-in-cheek phrase, but like it is far more complicated than this dude, fucking, what's his face over here, the famous anime scholar, shit-talking them back in 1983.
Who coined the term in his, and I quote, lolicon hentai manga magazine called Manga Buriko. For those of us who may require otaku translation into plain language, it was a magazine that fetishized children and portrayed them in obscene ways. From the very outset,
it was a
the
magazine
defining
of drawings,
characteristic
right?
of the otaku is unhealthy obsession. Wikipedia defines
No.
otaku
You cannot use Wikipedia to define otaku. My God, I'm going to have a hemorrhage. Please use a real book. Like, this version of it could be seen as, like, fairly unoffensive, but you can't use an uncited reference to Wikipedia to talk about these kind of things. My God. What are you... Yeah, otaku and lolicon are different as well. They don't... Otaku is a broader phrase, and this is the problem here, is where you need to read a book on otaku. You could read something of Patrick Galbraith. There are multiple books on otaku. Some of them are in English translation that you could be reading on that subject. You could even look up a mattering of interesting articles on the internet about otaku history. For one, otaku isn't necessarily an anime specific. It's a specific of maniac. Maniac was the original word used. It tends to be about, dedicated fans, specific fans. The bigger maniacs, you have train maniacs, train otaku, right? You have idol otaku, you have manga otaku, you have military otaku. You may see them in anime. There are photography otaku. There are specific ones. They tend to have a special interest that they dedicate themselves to. And within that, there might be the 3 C's. Things like creativity, collection, and community. These are core pillars of the otaku culture foundation. Some sort of creative response to the medium at which you care about. It doesn't need to be fancy. It doesn't need to be special. It can just be... It could be, I don't know, a fan scene. It could be you taking photos yourself. It could be making little drawings. It could be making stickers. There are so many different ways you could respond to the medium. You could write stuff about it. There is an infinite ways you can look at that. It's not anything super specific. Community, discussing it with other people in that community, having people that in that community, and fans that you talk about, you discuss, you debate. And collection because otaku is usually defined, as it says here, there is a consuming interest to it to a degree, depending on your money, of course, but there's actually an interesting quote that Miyazaki brings up in a quote we'll get to later. His version of the quote is not real, but I actually found it. I tracked someone down who had a copy of Animage 1989 November edition, where Ryo what is it, it's Mizutani, is it Mizutani, Ryo Mizutani, is it Murakami? No, it's Ryo Murakami and Miyazaki. They have a talk-to-talk conversation. And within that conversation, Miyazaki mentions the idea of meeting young men who buy thousands of videos and are happy living on calorie mate. As like, that would be a super otaku, right? Someone who is dedicated to the existence of like, I can eat calorie mate and I will spend all my money on video. And I think when he said video, he's mainly talking about like anime video. I mean, you probably would be considered otaku. Yeah, you had a creative response to anime, so I could totally see why they'd make that connection. That they might point you and go, "Oh, otaku," because it's like, well, yeah, I guess so. That's definitely a way of looking at it. There's a lot of books you could definitely easily engage with in the West on otaku and otaku history from an American perspective, like American otaku history, or even from a Japanese perspective. And Galbraith has made several books on that topic, but the way Mooney has approached this is that he has some quotes from Miyazaki of dubious authenticity. He has quoting directly uncited Wikipedia and his own personal opinions. That is an area of which probably made me want to make this reaction video to some degree, is that like there was a lot of grace shown to Chinese into Japanese animation and reading the document, reading that chapter, and then presenting that on the screen in a respectful manner. When otaku comes up, it's these people are vile creatures who are a poison to the world. That is kind of the vibe I get as he keeps talking about them through this video.
Necessarily builds his or her personality around a product being sold to them.
Again, like even this building a personality around a product, they're building it around a hobby. Yes, that all hobbies are unfortunately capitalist products in the modern day. Now, there are hobbies that are less so capitalist products, and there are ones that are more so. But like I just said, the three C's: creativity, yes, there is a collection, and there is community. When you specify it as, this is just consumerism, yeah, but most hobbies have some form of consumerism because of the era we live in. That's just how that is. Like, if you're into video games, even if you're into things like art, you're into photography, if you're into trains, all these things have a level of commercialization that come with them, and some of these natures you need to have money to even participate in them. He doesn't bring up the Miyazaki killer, but actually the article he was referencing at one point, which we'll get to later, does actually directly talk about that, which he didn't know, I don't think, or maybe he would have referenced it.
Its own products rather cynically around new emotional and sexual templates, around characters designed to be adored, to be desired, and to be owned. By the early 90s, this shift was impossible to ignore. Anime increasingly centered not only around grand adventures or moral dilemmas, but around characters carefully calibrated for emotional and sometimes parasocial, or even to coin a term here, fomantic attachment. Consider, for example,
well, I think this is good. You go back to the 80s for that sort of stuff, right?
Secretly doting tsundere. These aren't just characters; these are emotional.
But like a lot of these things are also adaptations, and you're talking about database again.
Even excitement.
When we talk about this stuff, this is the issue when you haven't read books about it. If you haven't read Beautiful Fighting Girl, if you haven't read Otaku Database, if you haven't read the Moe Manifesto, if you haven't read any book on the subject of otaku history or anime history in this area, these opinions are like, there's a rhyme and reason to this, there's a cultural history we can talk about, but this is not it. Also, when we talk about media mix, a lot of this stuff doesn't even start in anime. It comes from a different medium to begin with. So it's more complicated and multifaceted than simply the idea of making templates that make people want to fucking fall in love with them.
Might be fantasized about and ultimately merchandised. Shows like Sailor Moon, of which I'm a self-professed fan of, by the way, may have empowered a generation of young...
Even if he can't go into subject on everything, I think that the way he's talking about this is really ungraceful. Like, you don't have to go into massive details about otaku, but if you're only going to posit them in such a way in which you use Wikipedia and nothing else, but you make it a part of the video specifically about the gacha, and you know, it seems to be a focus, I don't think that's good. I think that you need to read on the subject to some degree. I would have just accepted one citation on otaku that isn't something from Wikipedia directly, just something that like talks about the history, because you can have an opinion where you don't like otaku. I don't think that's really the issue here, but at least do it within a context of what we're talking about here, because some of this stuff is not exactly what I would say helpful to the conversation.
Girls, but they also became vehicles for selling dolls, costumes, posters, and more.
Because the selling dolls, costumes, and stuff can go back to all the way to 1968. We could go back to,
meanwhile, titles aimed at
like Magical Girls, even from then.
Between affection and desire, between emotional connection and ownership. In 1998, there was.
But also, this subject here is it is absent of the concept of pure fantasy, which is where a lot of this concept comes. That like the otaku in themselves is very aware of the difference between fantasy and reality, because they like to play with the concept of fantasy, and the fantasy is appealing in itself to them in the 2D realms. So like that distinction is a very strong line, but when people critique otaku, they pretend like that line doesn't exist, or that they don't process that that line is actually very much part of the conversation in otaku spaces. No. See, he said at the beginning of this video that he said, I can't make a 4-hour video. There's people in the comment section of the video were like, I'd watch a 4-hour video. But I don't know if he'd go into this detail, even if he could.
This young man finds himself living in a dorm full of beautiful girls, each with a distinct tropey personality, with each of their potential affections.
I mean,
slowly
Love Hina is probably somewhat inspired by visual novels at the time. It's probably true.
Are framed as rewards for the protagonist's persistence. Almost like a video game.
No, if that's the most fair way of looking at Love Hina. I'm not really a big fan of it, but I haven't watched it since I was a kid.
The emotional grammar of anime, the tenderness, the introspection, the longing.
I might be going past my apologies. I might have actually went past the point at which I think I said in my in my document that it's probably best not to get too deep into this one as we go forward, because I think we're about to change chapters. Because I was going to go to 32 minutes, 52 even.
Extraction. This emotionality, this vulnerability,
we'll wait until the end of the section.
Didn't just become a commodity by accident. This commodification occurred alongside and was affected by the rise and retreat of feminism in post-war Japan and the cultural compromises that followed. So yeah,
I don't know if that's actually a relation that we can make academically. I don't know if those two things are necessarily connected or have much connection at all in that area. I think it is kind of a very complicated, multifaceted area of time. Again, because Japanese feminism is a very large topic, this next section of the video is mainly around, he does a history of Japanese feminism. It's probably not, I want to probably keep it to talking about cool Japan, anime history, and other such areas that relate to that. I think talking about the Japanese feminism side will be too much, and the video will get, my reaction will get too long. So that is why I'm going back to when we return to this topic at 52 minutes. The thing is, his description does not have further reading. Well, it has further reading, but he has about 4 or 5 documents in his description and sources. Only 4 or 5. Where the topic for a 2-hour video tends to take a lot more than 4 or 5 core sources to get that picture across. A lot of his quotes are not sourced directly in the document, which is why it took me a long time to find where some of those sources came from, which we'll get to in a bit later in terms of his Miyazaki quotes, because I had to try and find where the fuck did these quotes come from? When did Miyazaki say this? What's the direct source for these? Is it true? To verify them, it took me hours. And it's like, it comes from this, like, they're not even in the description. It's strictly like one of them he has a quote from. But the reason he has a source for it at all seems to be, to me, because the quote on, if I remember right, Goodread, is it Goodread? Goodread, Good Books, one of those, the book Wikipedia site, right? Had the quote at the bottom in some form, even though the quote of where it was from was incorrect.
Now, of course,
I mean, again, some of these anime he's showing are like their adaptations, so it's not necessarily that they were built for a wider, broader market. Not all of them. Some of them might be, but like they are, I guess, there is an earnestness into what they reflect in the author's mind. That doesn't always start from the idea of an anime trying to sell you products.
I'm not referring to all anime or manga here, and there were artists who attempted to subvert these problems within the industry and wider Japanese society. Even then, their subversion could be subverted or merchandised, and their message was often lost upon their
In the end of the day, like you, as someone who's creating anime in the industry, have to merchandise it. It is the capitalist system in which they create. You do not make money from anime as a product itself. You make money from the things that you can market anime from. You know, maybe your video releases, your movie tickets, your live shows, your merchandise, your internet streaming, etc. There are many different ways you can. The music sales, pachinko. There are many ways you can effectively monetize an anime. Sometimes very specific ones, but it usually doesn't come from the show run itself. Like there's a lot of ways, and you have to take on those boards if you actually want to break even in any way. That's just the nature of this business.
And where the memory of Umanribu was quietly shelved rather than publicly debated,
still need to go a bit further, do I?
To posturing was, is, and remains
we'll get to it.
Particularly
I think he's about to change back to the chapter
now. The woman
now.
who speaks openly about systemic sexism in Japan might not be seen as brave, but as confrontational, out of sync. too American, too Western. Even within anime fandom.
Okay,
feminist
I see. This is why I wanted to stop, wasn't it? Okay, this is actually why I wanted to stop. Now I'm remembering why I wrote down. This is the reason I wanted to stop. The Weeb Crew. Now, as you may know, I have been on the Weeb Crew. The problem here again with Moon's research, Mooney, I think he likes to be called. I have been on the Weeb Crew show. This tweet that he's looking at, is bait. This was bait. This was made to, catch people out. And it's also a reference to a much older image from 2016 with video games that used the same template. The idea being that there is no rhyme or reason. These things were put in there at random. And the joke kind of went that they eventually flipped them and did the same game again. Now, this version of the citation is from very early on. This tweet seemed to actually blow up, I remember. And it created... It was an interesting reaction in terms of the community, in terms of it became like an object of sublime, where people of any persuasion would look at the tweet as it is their enemy and would be like, how is X show this wing? And they would posit that in some way. It was an interesting breakdown to see, but it's funny to me because the Weeb Crow, when we did a reaction video to his first video on the subject of soft power and kawaii culture, we emailed Moon. And I assume it was through the Weeb Crow email that we did this, but we offered him to come on the show and explain to us, because there was a lot of points in the video where like, what does he mean by this? Where is he coming from this conversation? Where we would have liked to talk to him, even not in a confrontational way, but just to ask him like, so what did you mean by here? What was your perspective on this? We were going to ask him, and he said he didn't do those kind of things. He didn't do responses to the community or something along those lines in the video format. And we're like, fair enough, you don't want to come on, that's fine. But it's funny to me that he then picks out the Weeb Crew to then posit as like, so these sort of like reactionary grifters, where we did have a conversation with him. I don't know if he remembers. It might have just been in passing. And to be fair, one of the hosts might have used their actual personal email instead of the Weeb Crew. But I imagine they would have said, hey, we run the Weeb Crew podcast. We'd like to have you on to talk about your video. And I'm pretty sure when Moomy talked about that, it was not to be like, hey, we're going to bring you on so we can shit talk you. It was more, can we have a conversation about how you feel about the subject? But here, I guess, to Moon, it was just, oh, this guy looks bad. This looks bad. And I will not look any further into this. But then my initial outrage to this post, which to me was, it was funny to see. It, to me, relieves a sentiment of what I'm saying about this sort of like, a lot of the research in this video is kind of like the first view. If it would be on Wikipedia or I found this quote on the internet, there's no verification process. Now, I don't know if he needs to verify this like random silly shitpost tweet. I don't think it really matters in the end on that side of things. But it does sort of talk about how there's a lot of times that happens in this video, and we're going to get to some now, because I'm about to skip to a period where we're going to look at fake quotes from Miyazaki and Moon continually quoting them in this video. He does generally give a speech from a feminist of 40 years on YouTube you can watch. It's probably a very interesting video, which I think a lot of the information he got from this comes from, which is probably fine. You might want more than one source when you're looking at history like that, because then you have one person's opinion, but it's better to have a source like that than to use Wikipedia, so I'll take that. So here we go, we get to Miyazaki.
Miyazaki of Ghibli fame, amongst others, warned that the very soul of Japanese animation, its emotional honesty and complexity, was being eroded by industrialization and commercialization. In interviews, Miyazaki bitterly criticizes the rise of anime made by otaku for otaku, arguing that it traded emotional depth for self-indulgence, that it no longer sought to tell human stories, but to flatter its audience's desires.
Okay, maybe I'll let him go for a little bit, a second longer. Let's go maybe a second longer.
His grief wasn't just for the industry, it was for the hollowing out of this unique emotional vocabulary, for the inauthenticity that had permeated the medium. Miyazaki states, and I quote, almost all Japanese...
So here's the thing about quoting Miyazaki on this subject. It's a little bit complicated because Miyazaki himself is a curmudgeoned old man who is prone to shit-talking, but his perspective on otaku has not changed since 1984, I believe. He has said this about the industry, and yes, it's true that obviously in industrialization and commercialization happens in an anime industry like this. It is inherent to the position they are in, right? But his perspective on it goes back to the 50s. He goes, the 80s cartoons are like commercial, like plain food in comparison to the golden age of animation, which he deems to be the 50s. Miyazaki is unironically the guy who's like, anime was better when it wasn't anime. That is the kind of person he is. And when we talk about him criticizing otaku, yeah, he shit talks otaku, but Miyazaki is an otaku. He doesn't admit to being one, but he is an otaku. There's just no way around it. Miyazaki is a stereotypical military and plain otaku, and you could even say he's a European otaku. His interests in those fields are so broad and so dedicated. Like, I even have evidence. This is a clip from, the movie Kingdom Madness of Dreams. It's a very famous clip, but I think it proves the point of what I think is worth discussing when we talk about someone like Miyazaki, who is not infallible. He's just one guy, a guy with a complicated history in terms of a lot of different factors, you know, being a bit of a chauvinist himself, being a bit of a bully, being an otaku, but also someone who hates otaku. It's complicated, you know? I don't think you can use him as your white knight, and that's the problem here, is Mooney's perspective on otaku is solely defined by a couple of quotes, some that are not real, by Miyazaki and his own personal bias against people he's met on Twitter. Which is fine, if you hate people on Twitter, that's fine, but that doesn't represent a whole broader spectrum of people in this place, especially when we're talking about in the Japanese context.
オタクは何も学ばないのをオタクって言うんですからね。監督はオタクじゃない。僕はオタクじゃないです。
This is a beautiful edit. Look, that is an otaku. A second ago, if he'd shown a clip of someone else who wasn't Miyazaki doing that, he'd be like, that is an otaku who only cares about commercial goods. I think we have to be honest about this. Miyazaki also does comic books for a model. Miyazaki does comics for a model making magazine that he's done for years. They make like tanks, they make planes, they make this. He's very involved in these specific hobbies of his, in a way which, if he was anyone else, you'd probably call him an otaku. He just doesn't aspire to the able. He even had himself a 2D girlfriend when he was in high school. You know, he said about how he fell in love with Toei Animation's. What was her name? The White Serpent from the original movie, the 1958 movie. He said, it was like I had a girlfriend at the time who wasn't my girlfriend. It was something I grew out of, but at that time, I would continue to go watch this film to see my girlfriend. Miyazaki is so otaku-coded, it's fucking hilarious. So when we talk about Miyazaki making these kind of statements about otaku, he's mainly shit-talking. I don't know if we can really use it. You have to use it with a pinch of salt, because it's just him throwing down a big hammer on a group that he is disparaging towards. He does this all the time. Now, is there any truth to it? There's probably a kernel of truth to it, but also Miyazaki doesn't really engage in these mediums. He doesn't engage with modern anime in any capacity, really, outside of the stuff his friends make. To argue that otaku are not successful is a ridiculous statement. You cannot argue that. Hideaki Anno is a blatant, true blue otaku, and he is incredibly successful. Otaku and success are not the same thing. Like, you can be an otaku and be successful in your life. There can be a line between these two factors in which you can be a perfectly functioning member of society who has otaku interest, who has a special interest, who then live with it. I think that's perfectly normal. And you can also be an otaku. I mean, for fuck's sake, Leiji Matsumoto considered himself a maniac, which, you know, the old word for otaku. When people asked him about this in 1982, he was like, well, I'm an otaku too, or, quote, in this engine, I'm also a maniac. So he represented in that way. Leiji Matsumoto, incredibly influential mangama. I would not say there's any possible way you could ever say he's not successful. There are many people in those industries who are successful. Like, it's a separation of complete things. I mean, I don't know if he thinks success is part of it, though. His opinion on them goes all over the place. I mean, it's mainly him, you know, angry man shouting at cloud stuff. You know, he's just being an old man. He does this, but he kind of shit talks everyone. Like, it's kind of equally opportunist for Miyazaki. Miyazaki will shit talk Oshii. He will shit talk. I don't know if he shit talks Arno too much, but I think he probably has in some capacity. You know, he shit talks Takahata. He shit talks Tomino. It's kind of like, it's just the style of man that he is. He is a very blunt individual, we could say. Anyway, I will get back to the video, and there'll probably be more to talk about in a moment. I believe this quote comes from, I guess it was a screen-capped series from a Japanese source, which was probably some interview he had I think it was in 2014 the images came up. I think it was probably a TV interview, but he basically said the same thing he did in that the movie quote I just showed you, the documentary about the Kingdom of Madness and Dreams. It was basically the same sentiment here. What he's quoting here is a very similar version of that, which Miyazaki's been fairly consistent in saying. I think he's also mentioned in the Starting Point book. You can find him in interviews also saying something akin to that. But yeah, I'll keep going.
Animation is produced with hardly any basis taken from observing real people.
Again, this is probably not true either.
It's produced by humans
you kind of need
who
to.
Can't stand looking at other humans, and that's why the industry is full of otaku. End quote.
I mean,
but
the industry's probably
turning. Anime's emotional.
The industry's probably full of otaku because it's not a very well-paid job. It's a very high-demand job, and the only people who would really want to be in that industry are people who are dedicated to the craft, who are so dedicated to animation that, of course, they end up in it. They're not getting into it because they accidentally fall into it, because it's like, why would I do it at this rate? That's kind of the more realistic thing that happens as time goes on, is that when it becomes less and less of a decently paying job or okay paying job, depending where you're going, it only advocates, only hardcore people will then end up joining. That's just, that's kind of how it's going to be.
Born of real vulnerability was too potent not to be commodified. And soon, what once had been a tool for empathy,
I mean, you could argue that Mushi Pro is a
Consider
commodification. That would be Miyazaki's perspective. Miyazaki's perspective on Tezuka is he ruined animation. When Tezuka died, Miyazaki wrote an article that was literally like, "Fuck you, Tezuka, you destroyed animation." That was like what the article was. After he died, that's what I'm saying. He's such a combative little fuck. Like, he'll do that. He's such a shit stirrer when he does that sort of stuff, where it's like, I don't know if that's really the time to be making that point. He also spread some misinformation in that article. But look, it was in 1988. I'm not going to fucking cold drag him for it now. It's like, what's done is done. But like, yeah, I think that the argument that Miyazaki would be making actually goes back far further than the one that Mooney's making.
For example, the rise of moe and the evolution of kawaii culture. Both concepts rooted in emotional openness, but each transformed into powerful...
Yes, so I think someone in the chat's asking, yeah, it is real. There's an interview from Miyazaki about Tezuka. It came out in 1989. It's in the Starting Point book, which I think is under my bed, so I can't get it right now. I have Turning Point behind me, but not Starting Point. But it is very easy to find in the Starting Point book because it's called like an essay to Tezuka or something like that. You'll find it in the index quite quickly. But yeah, it's him shit-talking Tezuka. It's him spreading rumors about Tezuka about a period of time when he wasn't at Toei. He said that the reason Tezuka made a character ill in Sayuki, the 1960 adaptation of his manga, which is based on Johnny the West, is that he said it would save animation. That's what Miyazaki heard because, again, Miyazaki was not at Toei in 1960. He joined Toei in 1962. Several years after Tezuka had nothing to do with the studio. So he's talking about something he's heard third hand because he was not working there. I don't know if any of the people he knows directly very well were working there. Maybe like Otsuka or his mentors would have been there. I don't know if they would have badmouthed Tezuka in such a way though. But I don't know where he's gotten this information from. But it has to be a rumor or something he heard from someone who works at Toei after he joined it several years later.
Engines of commercial appeal. Moe refers to a deep instinctive feeling of affection or protectiveness towards fictional characters. Generally, this means a young, emotionally fragile or socially awkward girl. This term moe was originally an organic fan term, but it quickly...
I have it under my bed because my bed opens up and there's like stuff in it. So like there's like a compartment under it.
Characters not to express ideas or challenge assumptions, but to elicit a predictable emotional...
Okay, and when we're talking about moe is more complicated than it's giving.
Soft, melancholy, and innocent. Audiences were encouraged to feel needed, protective, or even attached.
Again, moe is a bit more complicated than that. It's not a genre. It's a bit more... you have to read the Moe Manifesto, at least, when we're talking about this. It's not a genre. There's a lot to it. And also, it's maybe not the best to be shown Bocchi the Rock, which was written by a woman in a For Coma magazine about her personal experience. I think it's a little bit rude to use Bocchi the Rock as your example of some sort of codification when it is relating to a real woman's experience. I think it's a little bit infantilizing and a little bit disrespectful. There are many other shows you could have used that would have been just as fine. Bocchi the Rock is probably not the one you should be using for that optics reason. I would say it's not the best choice of example.
Characters weren't written with complex inner lives. They became constructed like emotional puzzles, optimized to evoke longing, desire, or sympathy. Averted gazes, stammered speech, tragic backstories, apologetic gestures. These all became viral.
Moe is quite a
shorthand for
multifaceted
commodified
thing. It's not really a set thing. There's also
Kawaii
gap
culture
Moe, right?
followed
It's
a
the reverse. So
similar
there's
path.
all these kind of ways you can
Originally,
approach
kawaii
this.
simply meant cute, charming, childlike, innocent. But in post-war Japan, especially from the 1970s and onwards, kawaii evolved into something more. Not a mere adjective to describe cuteness, but a lifestyle.
All right, let me just say. So Bocchi the Rock is based on... I don't know if necessarily true is the word. Kind of. I mean, the author is a woman who bases the experience of Bocchi's life as a socially introverted, awkward person on her own life. She is a very big music fan. I don't know if she ever played in a band or anything like that, but there's like kernels of her life within the work of Bocchi. Obviously, maybe you want to replace being in a band as being a mangaka, right? And that would probably be the trajectory. But she is notoriously very secret, like kind of quite secretive, quite reclusive. There's a funny story back when Bocchi first popped off about she went to Comic Cat to sell her Blue Archive doujins. And the show had gotten so popular at that point, they had to kind of move her out of the main area because the queue had got too big. So she ended up being in this like really small, weird, obscure like area outside of the convention because they had no place to put her with the giant line. So she ended up being like off to the side where people didn't even know that was her because obviously she's very private about appearance, but she was just selling the Blue Archive in some random spot in the place, you know, being like, they don't know I'm the author of Bocchi the Rock or something like that. I think maybe some people did, but yeah, it sounded like a story that would happen to Bocchi themselves. Suffering from success, you could call it. So popular they can't put you on a fucking stall because your line was too big.
And ultimately, a marketing tool. Kawaii at first was something of a countercultural movement, a rebellion. Young women...
Yeah, Bocchi is well, I'm using doujin in the fan term. I don't know if it was explicit per se, but they are a big fan of Blue Archive, and they made a fan manga based on it that they sold at Comic Cat. Not unusual for a mangaka to be selling fan works at Comic Cat. That's very common. Comic Cat was once founded by women. Women are like the defining force of Comic Cat back in the 70s. They were the thing that created Comic Cat itself were women.
Rejected the harshness of the adult world by embracing exaggerated softness in return. But over time, this rebellion was aestheticized, absorbed by the market, and sold back to people as identities.
I mean, that's just how
Idol agencies,
commercialization
fashion
works.
brands, animation studios, VTuber studios, and corporations like Sanrio discovered that cuteness wasn't just appealing, it was very profitable. Cuteness begets affection.
Again, I think this is you have to be a little bit careful when you do this. Like, I feel like it's not a good idea to take, like, these aren't virtual characters, these are real people. Like, you may say the designs are cute, which, yeah, I could agree that, like, the designs of Holy Lives are supposed to be, like, cute art designs, right? But the women who then stream are real people. They are not... Their job is not to commodify otaku. Their job is to stream and be entertaining. And they have real thoughts, they have real examples. They are basically just using a performative mask to do their job. And I think that approaching it like this is not actually... Again, I feel like it's a little bit rude to those you know, performers to act this way a little bit. I don't know. I feel like this is I mean, if you could put Miko on the screen, I mean, Miko's not real, right? But these people are real people behind their, you know, masks, let's say.
It softens interactions. It makes people easier to like. And
yeah, I watch
things
VTubers. I'm pretty
easier to
well aware
sell.
of who these
This
VTubers are.
emotional
I mean, some of these have
work
graduated, right?
appearances
Like,
to
several of the ones you show on
emotions
screen
and
aren't
making
even
others feel
working
good
for
is
Holy
part
Life
of
anymore.
what
They're independent.
sociologist Arlie Hochschild famously called in her 1983 book, The Managed Heart, emotional labor.
You could argue that,
Emotional
yes,
labor
that being a
refers to the
streamer
work
is
of
some form of
managing one's
emotional
own
labor, I
emotions or
suppose,
the emotions
if
of
you want to go
others
that way.
as part of a paid job. Think of the service worker who must smile and empathize and absorb
where are we at?
frustrations, not because they want to, but because their
5.
paycheck demands it. Their emotional performance is part of the labor. It becomes part of the product. Cuteness becomes a form of emotional labor performed in speech, posture, and appearance. A way to
next
signal
section after that?
approachability, docility, availability, and non-threatening femininity. Whether you're a pop idol, a maid cafe waitress, a cosplayer, or just a cashier at Family Mart. Like Moe, kawaii becomes a system of signifiers. Big eyes, high voices, oversized sweaters, bows, apologies, and clumsy gestures. These aren't just traits, they are carefully crafted and marketed cues, designed to disarm and to make characters, products, and women more desirable through manufactured infantilization. And because this
again, I don't know. I
so
feel like it's really
commercially
rude to be saying that about real people who are streaming, even if they are
It
streaming for a
saturates not
corporate
just
thing.
anime,
But like,
but pop
you know,
culture.
being an independent streamer is incredibly difficult, especially in the VTuber space. Like, it's hard to get any traction. Some people do it, right? But that, you know, it's kind of like a golden ticket to get into one of these corporations, and then you work it as long as you feel necessary, and then you can go independent if you want, and then reap the rewards of that, or you can stay with the company as long as you want. But like, it's, you know, it is ultimately a choice of these artists in question that they do this. And I feel like you have to give them some agency in that when we're talking about real people and not like fictional characters.
Again, not because it reflects the lived experiences of women, but because as a commodity, it sells.
I mean, there's probably
so
some.
Well. Kawaii
But it
has become
obviously
a form of
sells. I mean, that's
emotional
the
expression,
capitalism, right?
descriptive critique, a performance of choice and identity detached from the politics that might cause one to ask the fundamental questions of the fourth wave. Why did Kawaii come about? What does it say about femininity? Who gets to define femininity?
I mean,
and who?
I don't know if anime's working conditions has
And
much
as the line
to
between
do with that. I
sincere
think those are
expression
separate
and
issues,
exploitative
separate
indulgence
disconnected
grows increasingly
things.
thin, we arrive at what might be called the otaku fantasy, a cultural and commercial feedback loop where vulnerability,
Where was I supposed to
cuteness, and
go?
emotional
I think I
labor
didn't
are
write
not
my last
merely
time
aesthetic
code, so I might be in a
choices,
bit of a problem, but
interactive fantasies designed for
I'll have to play it by
consumption.
ear now.
In this fantasy, a character is not merely observed, not
When did
merely
I-
understood, they are owned like
did I
emotional
go?
property. Doing what they believe with once more to Hayao
This is what
Miyazaki.
happened.
Miyazaki
Here we go.
once stated, many of my movies have strong female
So-
leads. Brave, self-sufficient girls
I'll let
that
him
don't
finish.
think twice about fighting for what they believe with all their heart. They'll need a friend or a supporter, but never a savior. Any woman is just as capable of being a hero as any man. But this
Here is the problem with that. That quote is not real. That quote is an illusion that came from an art project by somebody who posted it on DeviantArt in 2012. That is not a real quote from Miyazaki. Miyazaki never said that. Mooney has found this quote somewhere, has not tried to pre-source it back to where it came from, and has just gave it to his audience. That is a problem. You have to at least find if it was from an interview or something. Even when I was tracing it back, I traced it back to 2013 first time, and I found it in an essay, but it was completely uncited. So I was like, oh, maybe it's a made up from this essay. A friend of mine, study of swords, told me that apparently that he found the original source of this coming from a 2012 art project, which I have right with me. This is the original image which this quote comes from. Again, a 2012 art project from someone, I'm assuming, in art college. These are the quotes that they used for the project, many art-wise, right? But they created a fake sort of, it was like a comic, so this loose comic with Miyazaki doing this sort of quote that they made up, which was supposed to, I guess, considering it's the nature of it, I believe it's supposed to, like, their opinions of representing his work. You know, and it's the quote right here, this quote here at the bottom of it, which was drawn up, this is the quote he just put on screen. So, yeah, this is not a real quote. This is not something he said about that. Now, if you want to ask about what Miyazaki's opinion of the women in his movies are, well, that's kind of an interesting but also complicated question, because his perspective on this has changed quite a bit over time. Well, not even changed. He's very flippant on it. He doesn't give very strong answers, but he's also asked about this question a lot. Well, he didn't find the source because he didn't reference with the sources. I had to find the source. So he quoted the quote, didn't say where it was from or where he found it. So I had to then reverse engineer it to find any reluctance. I had to also type out by hand because, again, he didn't source it directly. So I had to type out the entire quote by hand to then try and find it on the internet. And then I had to do like internet time searches back to 2012, back to 2010, and try to go back as far as possible. I first heard it was from a Guardian article, so I had to go and find the Guardian article. It had been deleted, so I then had to go way back machine the Guardian article and see if it was a direct interview with Miyazaki. It was not. It was an analysis of his work that quoted it without any source. So then I had to go back even further. That interview was from 2015. So I was like, well, how far back does this go? I found an essay from 2013 which quoted the source. And I was like, okay, does this give a source for that quote? I looked for all their sources. It was not there. I was like, then looking back even further, and it was like, oh, I found it on Goodreads? Is it from Goodreads? Did someone just make it up and put it on Goodreads? And then my friend, Study of Swords, told me, no, it's from an art project from DeviantArt. Here is a link directly to that project from 2012. So that's how I found the project in the end. I don't know what Mooney did to find it. I'm assuming he just found the quote on the internet and copied and pasted it. So anyway, let's get back to the book I was going to bring up originally. Where have I put it? Right here. So in 15 years at Ghibli, in Chapter 3, when Miyazaki was in America for the first time, he did interviews where he was asked questions specifically about his perspective on women in his films. Now let me give you an excerpt of what Albert said about that time. So if I can find the exact time, making films particularly stressful. Let me see if I can find the interview. It comes in a little bit later than this. How many pages in is it? It was somewhere around here. Yeah, here we go. I will read it for your audience. This is page 79 of 15 Years at Studio Ghibli, Sharing the House with the Never-Ending Man. So, this comes from the interview. Most of the reporters of these interviews would ask the exact same questions and expect to get an individualized response. In this respect, Miyazaki is actually a reporter's dream, since he also never gave the same answer when asked exactly the same question. So, reporter, the main characters of this film is a young woman. Do all your films have women or girls as the heroines? At 10 a.m., Miyazaki says yes. At 10:30, Miyazaki says no. At 11 a.m., Miyazaki says half of my films have heroes, half of them have heroines. The split between male and female is about 50-50, like the human race. I think that percentage is about right. At 11:30, Miyazaki said, when I conceived the film, I didn't really pay attention to whether the main character was a male or a female. At 12 p.m., Miyazaki says, I wanted to make a film for 10-year-old girls, so of course the main character is a female. At 12:30, Miyazaki says, women generally make better main characters, so I always try to have a main character be female. As you can see there, that is 6 different answers in about 2 hours. Now, are there sentiments that he generally agrees in there? I assume so, but I don't know Miyazaki, right? But he'll kind of give a spiel all over the place. In another interview, which we'll come up to later, which will be coming up, with a different interview of Miyazaki, he says in that interview that basically he thinks that having male protagonists is a pain in the ass. Because while it's simpler, he thinks the kind of stories you can do with men, in his mind, are a little bit more basic. There's another quote he has from 1984. So here's the quote here. This quote is from Young Magazine, February 1984. Miyazaki is asked about women in his films again. He says, while men are not in good shape these days, when a man is shooting a handgun, it just feels like he's shooting because that's his job. He has no other choice. It's not good. When a girl is shooting a handgun, that's really something. So, while Miyazaki sometimes gets a reputation, especially in the Western sphere, of being a bit of a feminist, he is also very much a 20th century chauvinist. So there's this weird sort of contradiction in Miyazaki sometimes, where he'll say something progressive about women, but then he'll also say something that's not so progressive about women. And we'll get to that when we get to the full quote that comes up a little bit later.
This authenticity has no place in the commodified otaku fantasy. Miyazaki continues in this 1988 interview with Animeju magazine, and I quote, "It's difficult. My female protagonists immediately become the subjects of Rorikon Goko, play toys for
Oh, here we go. Fuck, that was fast.
models. In a sense,
This quote is also, I think, from Goodreads, and this quote is horrifically butchered. I had to spend some time finding this. For one thing, I said it before, it is not Animage 1989. This quote comes from Animage 1989 November edition. So I think there is a slight miscommunication here about what Animage is. This is an interview with Ryo Murakami, another writer, and the problem here is it's difficult. My female protagonists immediately become the subjects of Rorikon. This is not a great translation. I think if I remember right, the translation is something like, basically, I guess a localization of it would be like, they become subject of the fantasy of lolicons, but this comes in a broader conversation, which he is skipping. In a sense, we want to depict something for who's affirmative to us. We have no choice but to make them as lovely as possible. This is not exactly what he is saying here. I read the original 7 pages. I skimmed through the actual Japanese one. I was able to find a copy of it, because this version of the quote is a small paraphrasement from the website nausicaa.net, which I believe in 2007, maybe, found this quote. Now, I will read out the entire quote to give more context to what this quote is actually about. Because when you look at it like this does not actually represent what is being said in the quote, where they start talking about his women protagonists. So this is 1989. This is probably a couple months after the Miyazaki killer incident. So earlier on in the interview, they do talk about the Miyazaki killing incident man with the same name, who the media said was an otaku as a way to smear him and smear otaku. He had more horror DVDs than he had anime, VHSs, sorry. But they used it as a sort of like scandalous, like otaku are serial killers kind of perception, which was just tabloid trash, basically. Very little rhyme or reason to it. But they start talking about that earlier on. Ryu seems to be kind of the opinion that it is basically just it's basically like a distraction from the actual situation that it's in, and he kind of pushes away having that conversation multiple times in the interview, it seems. So what happens here is they start talking about it. Miyazaki says, yes, when I think about making a male lead, it gets really intricate. The problem isn't simple. I mean, the story is like everything will be fine once you defeat him. It's better to have a male as a lead. But then you're stuck with these sort of male adventure stories where you have no choice but to do something like Indiana Jones, with a Nazi and someone else who's a villain in anyone's eyes. We can't do anything other than that. It's easy to depict a boy who wants to do a thing, be an adventurer, basically, and live and can't help but live slovenly. He has more than enough energy, but he doesn't know how and where to use it, or even to use the energy. He can find ways only after a long detour. I can make such a story, but when people ask me, why do you always make stories about a girl? And then Ryu responds being like, I was confused. What if Nausicaa was a man? I think the scene where Nausicaa was on the golden feelers, I think this is the tentacles of the Omu. If she'd been a man, I would have been like, are you stupid? Big laugh. But, look, we're talking to a bunch of men from the 80s who are probably a little bit chauvinistic. We'll put it that way. And in fact, this quote is kind of Miyazaki being a bit of a chauvinist. When you cut out the context, it may appear like he's being like very against otaku, but the reason he's talking about this is because what he says next, where he's like, well, that is true, big laugh, or something along those lines. But while making animation, I always feel I'm making big lies. For example, could we depict a affirmative, it says here? Sometimes this word will be translated as affirmative or positive character. Can we depict this sort of character, affirmative character, with a so-so average-looking girl? What we're doing is a show, in a sense, after all. Basically saying he doesn't think he could make the films he can, in his opinion, with a so-so looking girl, an average-looking girl. Where Ryu responds to him being like, well, if they said kawaii in the thing, so if they're cute, isn't that good enough? And that's when the quote starts, where Miyazaki says, it's difficult. They immediately become the subject of lolicon's desires. In a sense, if you want to depict someone who is affirmative or positive to you, it says us, I think the word was jibun, so I think he means himself, to myself. So we here, they sometimes translate with we. I think he might be talking about the author as well, but I think he's mainly talking about himself in this conversation. He's not saying that otaku are forcing them to make this kind of works. He's saying that you have no choice but to make them as cute as possible. But then he goes on to say there are some people who take it too far. He says they shamelessly depict such heroines as their pets. And then things escalate more and more. And when we're talking about human rights and women, I don't want to analyze too much. Now, this part of the conversation this is where the quote on the website ends. But this conversation part here where he's talking about analyzing is him going back to directly mention the Miyazaki killer case again. Which happens then in response is Ryu basically says, we're not going to talk about that. There's no point in analyzing such things. You cannot break down the foolishness of these people and these silly things they're doing. It's not worth looking into. It's probably something to comfort themselves. And then he requests, as a fan from Miyazaki, please don't worry about such stupid things and spend your time dedicated to making good work. And then the interview ends, with Miyazaki agreeing that it's probably not worth analysing. So that's kind of a different context to the one that Mooney is bringing to this table here. That he doesn't know that this is in response to some way the Miyazaki killing incident and the scandal around that, which every anime creator seems to get vast for at the time. But also that it is about Miyazaki being like, no, my girls need to be pretty. I can't make it if my anime if the girls aren't pretty. I just can't believe it. That is what Miyazaki is saying, which also then relates back to what happened with Oshii and him during 1985 when they had a conversation about the same topic, where Oshii said, can't we just make the girl kind of plain and maybe like a sort of weird little girl character for the main character of Anka? And Miyazaki said in a drunken stupor to Oshii's book's version of the event, so this is probably at Miyazaki's cabin in 1985, I believe. It's in one of Oshii's books. I've quoted it in prior things. I could probably find the source somewhere later. But he says, in its very infamous quote of Miyazaki, what's so wrong with being in love with a 12-year-old girl? Which Isao Takahata responds, Miyazaki, that's a very dangerous thought. Miyazaki at this point probably in a drunken shouting stupor, but it seems to relate back to his concept of Miyazaki being very attached to this idea of presentation, about his women looking a certain way, about his characters being a certain way, and that he can't envision it if they're not that way. So this is why it's not good to be using someone like Miyazaki as your example, especially when you are kind of like half quoting something that you found on the internet and not the original source, or reading the entire article it's from to look at the context. It wasn't easy to find that anime article, but I did it, and I'm not even making the fucking video about the topic, is what I'm saying.
Remember.
Again, this interview is not him seeing a mile away. He is simply responding to a crisis that happened, and then he's being kind of like... It's kind of lucky that Ryu is like a very measured responder, because a lot of the time he's like, yeah, it's probably a waste of time to talk about this subject, because basically, the magazine, people, they want you to give some sort of scandalous quote to sort of like, so they can put it in the tabloids, right? So it's probably not really worth talking about it, because we don't really have much of opinion on this factor, in that like, this man was a horrible person who did horrible things, but it didn't really relate to the subjects we're talking about here. It just happened to be that he had a collection of videos of different like interest. That had nothing to do with the actual crimes he committed. This is simply just like, obfuscation. We're looking at something over here instead of actually dealing with the real problem at hand.
Was from 1988.
1989.
Consider how far things have come since then. In the otaku fantasy, the moe girl isn't compelling because she grows and challenges the viewer as Miyazaki's protagonists might. She's compelling because she is a safe space that demands nothing from the otaku.
Yeah, but like people would also critique,
Hosoda
critiqued Miyazaki's perspective on this as well in the past, we know, because he creates what Hosoda would call like really overly perfect characters, or ones that are like full of energy and full of like optimism and seem to be able to enthrall people. Like, I think in that you're using the stereotypes from like Nausicaa, right, in terms of this character who's almost biblically like I wouldn't say Jesus, more like a Moses figure, like who's so amazing and is of royal blood and is able to do all these magical things and get people like stir their souls just by her mere presence. And that's a different thing entirely.
Leaks out of the fiction and into reality. In my video, Gacha Games in the South Korean Gender War, we discussed briefly how misogynists, mainly in this case perpetually online young men in South Korea, will call their own Korean women kimchi-nyo. Kimchi women,
yeah, this is pretty vile.
Implying they're rotten like kimchi, that they're superficial, gold-digging, and of poor quality. These same misogynists contrast these rotten kimchi women with sushi-nyo, sushi women, implying freshness, obedience, and depth, referring in this case
Again,
to the
this is really
perception
vile.
of what an idealized Japanese woman might be. Where do these men get their idealized perception of Japanese women from? I'll give you...
Oh, okay, so this is again where I take issue with this sort of statement
it's not from
here.
heavily censored Korean media, which would prefer to paint Koreans in a better light. Why do these men have such a distorted view of reality? Well,
This is the argument that the tabloids would be making in 1989.
Constantly engaging with a fantasy that coddles their egos.
So you can't just say like, oh, they watched anime, then they turned into like right-wing incels. I mean, maybe he's not saying that directly, but he's saying that it's some sort of part of that makeup. But like when we look at people, especially who are like far right in this context, generally their perspective is, quote, you see this a lot of times in all different cultures, like these women are too liberal. It's these women from in colonized land or different land who I think are more conservative. They're the good ones. Like, that is such a stereotypical perspective. It goes beyond, I think it goes back to the philosophy of people who live within that political reality, than it does have anything specifically to do with anime, which is a very versatile nature. Also, interesting side point that we can bring up about Japanese people who could be considered, I guess, nowadays to be called incels. I do believe I wrote this down. Where did I put it? Mal Magazine. This is about the, I guess, what would be called incels in Japan, but the earlier ones from about 2007, who were also otaku. And they have a very specific name, which is quite interesting over there, but also their breakdown of the event was quite different than the one he is necessarily operating here within these sort of binary positions within how this cultural attack happens. This group is called, there's several of them, but they usually go by the name the Revolutionary Alliance of Unpopular Men. The Revolutionary Alliance of Unpopular Men. Because they are Marxists. Because alleged to the story here, when the creator of such a group came together, this was after he was broken up with by his girlfriend. And in that, he started reading Marx and decided that it seemed to him that the reason that it was so difficult to date and sort of, find love in a modern and contemporary world of long hours and, lack of third spaces was that it was capitalism's fault that this happened. And he effectively made a group of men called the Revolutionary Alliance of Unpopular Men. Some of them could be called the revolutionary grouping of men that women are not that into or not that attracted to. It was an interesting divide on this concept, but they are probably one of the most popular of this. And if you remember the anime Welcome to the NHK, I believe it happened a little bit before this group became popular, but there is a reference to the similar sentiment within the culture at the time of, I believe, one of them saying that, that romance is some byproduct of capitalist society within the NHK. Some question about that, which would probably relate to these type of subgroups, whose perspective are more critical on the material conditions than they are necessarily on women themselves, though they can also have some goofy opinions. They're very funny, but I think I'm more using to say that it isn't inherent that anime will convert you into this sort of women-hating individual. There are more factors than just media that do that. Obviously, people are complicated, but these opinions also don't seem that unique to really vile far-right, incel otakus. They do seem to have a more broader coalition of people who might think that within that political sphere. I don't know about Mao necessarily. It's probably Marx more so than Mao, but yeah, I don't know if there was actually much more. I think those are the main areas of the video. I'm going to see what the next chapter is, but we've been going for a long time, so maybe it would be best
in exchange for their affection and their money.
Sort of start summing up
it's
my
the
points here.
Allegory of the cave, right? These perpetually online internet men, not just in Korea, but in Japan, in China.
Again, when he said Japan, it's he hasn't looked into these sort of groups who would be the first that would come up within the Japanese sphere, who have very different perspectives than the Koreans in the chat. Not in the chat necessarily, but in the broader sphere, okay?
And here in the West as well are chained prisoners looking at shadows on the wall. They're trapped in a cycle of commercial exploitation that keeps them locked away from genuine intimacy.
Yes, and that genuine intimacy is stopped by them, in quote of them, by the capitalist system. The ability not to get away, the ability not to have third spaces, the ability that, most people now unfortunately will meet through some sort of commodified dating app, which feels like a job, sort of, what would you call it, like a job application more than it does feel like some sort of way to socialize with people. That they only serve you if you spend a lot of money. These problems are multifaceted and complicated, and do not relate just simply to one or two things, including cartoons.
Distorted reality designed to ensnare them as consumers. And over time, that distorted reality becomes the only one that they know and the only one that they can relate with.
Is in direct in relation to the idea of pure fantasy, which is a common practice in otaku spaces of knowing that there's a very big difference between 2D and 3D.
Sold to the consumer, where softness is obedience, trauma is exciting, and care is a reward to be purchased. It is a
there is a part about soft power somewhere in here too, isn't there? It might be towards the ending.
There is one industry where all of these elements come together.
Which we might want to talk about.
The commodification of anime, the exploitation of emotional labor, and the otaku fantasy.
This is, I think, when he gets to the actual gotcha point of his video. Now, unfortunately, I do not have another hour to spend going through his gotcha thesis. But that is, this first hour and 10 minutes is basically him building up to the point of where I suppose the actual gotcha part of the video starts. Now, again, I'm going to have to, unfortunately, get past all that now, I reckon. I don't think we're going to get too far into that. And keep bringing up Abe, despite Abe being dead for 3 years and not being a politician for 5. Well, not a prime minister. Yeah, I don't know about that one. Where does it come into? It's about here, when he starts bringing up Cool Japan. We do need to talk about Cool Japan. I guess we'll go from here and we'll talk a little bit about Cool Japan, because I also have a book on Cool Japan we can get into.
The LDP realized this almost immediately. In the 1950s and 60s, the Japanese government undertook a massive project of national reconstruction, which sought not only to rebuild the Japanese economy, but to deliberately rebrand Japan's global image. Through so-called guided capitalism, an economic model where the state actively selects and supports
I mean, you
key
don't have to like
sectors,
moe
rather
anime,
than
right?
leaving
Well,
them
it's like a
entirely to
vague
market
thing,
forces.
but like
The government handpicked certain industries like
I also think that kind of talks about the broadness of otaku, which I was mentioning before, is that like to be an otaku, you could be a military otaku, you could be a trained otaku, you could be someone who's into idols only, you could be someone who's into specifically military wear, you could be someone into tanks, you could be someone into a very specific type of anime. It doesn't have to be like anime is an incredibly broad intersection of content. You could be incredibly into just mecha. You could be incredibly into I don't know, sports like manga and anime. You could be a really big fan of like Slam Dunk or something, you know? You could be a basketball otaku. Like, you don't have to be into like specifically these moe type shows. Like, or again, moe is a broad indicator of things, you know, slice of life shows, romance shows. Obviously, these have been popular for an incredibly long time within the history of anime. But, you know, that doesn't have to be to your taste. That's fine. But that, you know, you can be an otaku in all manner of ways. Like, it doesn't have to be so simple that it fits into this very specific way of looking at it.
electronics, automobiles, and heavy
So this part of the
machinery,
video now is
and
about soft
cultivated them
power
through
history,
some
which is, again, is a sequel to him talking about soft power in his last video to some degree.
cities, low-interest loans, export incentives, and
Right now, we seem to be in the 60s when they're talking about the industrialization of Japan.
protectionist tariffs. And alongside these economic efforts, diplomatic efforts abroad worked in tandem to create an image of New Japan. Take a look at Japan's pavilion at the 1958 World's Fair in Brussels. What's on display here? At the top, there's the ruins of Hiroshima. We're not the invaders, we're the victims. In the center,
Well, both can be true, right? Because when we talk about the casualties of war, who are civilians, we usually consider those people victims of war, right?
And in the background,
Like the people of Hiroshima are victims of American brutality.
Bunka Gaiko were launched through organizations like the Japan Foundation.
Okay, we need to stop now. I remember I have something to show everyone. I have something to show everyone about the Japan Foundation. Because he's talking about Japan Foundation, which did have some work with anime in the Middle East in the 70s, mainly in local communities. But in the last video, he talked about soft power maybe a little bit too presumptively in the earlier years of this concept. He sort of brought up things happening in the 70s when this idea was not even on the table. In fact, I can tell you exactly when this was actually on the table for both the government but also the industry by using this clip. This clip is from Animego series on the development of anime in America as a publication, as distribution, right? It's a really fantastic series. I would all recommend people in the chat to watch the series if you have any interest in the history of how anime came to the West, specifically America, but sometimes Britain, in English-speaking spaces, because it talks about something that was kind of missing in his last video on this topic about how grassroots the anime fandom was in the 80s all the way to the 2000s. So let's look at this clip.
Side, our print publishing side.
On the right, we have Central Park Media's head, or old head, and I think this is Justin Savakis. I think that's how you say his name. Apologies if it isn't. He is the head of Animego now. And he is interviewing him, and they're asking about how the Japan Society saw anime in the 90s, all the way to the 2000s, when Central Park Media's communicated with bodies of the government. But he also has another quote earlier on about how the industry in Japan, especially Japanese companies, related to anime as a foreign product. And I'll have to paraphrase the other one.
Right. So I think it was 94, 95, we went into the manga side of things. I crack up. For 10 years we tried to sponsor anime film showings at Japan Society, and they absolutely refused.
Why do you suppose that is?
That would be a very good example of how Japan, as a country, completely failed to understand the significance of its software.
Shout out to Shabes, who edited this video.
To the rest of the world.
The stuff that we were releasing here, what was that to them? Like, how did they regard it?
Low class, right? You have Johin, you have Geihin. Johin would be your assuming artwork, your shobu, your wonderful screens.
So this is the good shit to the Japan Society.
It would be the woodblock prints, the ukiyo-e.
This is what they want to promote in foreign countries from 1970 to 2000 plus.
For the commoners. because aristocrats would never have that in their house. The attitude I could be summarized by what every American mother told their kids in the 50s and 60s growing up reading comic books. That stuff will rot your brain. Very famous article on Japan's Cool Japan soft power. Yeah, we in the anime business, manga business, we're basically trying to communicate that to Japan Inc., if you will,
Yeah.
for like 20 years before the article finally came out in Foreign Policy magazine.
There we go, 20 years.
And then they said, oh, gosh, yeah, cool power, right? Cool Japan. Let's spend a lot of government money, taxpayer money, let's piss it away in really stupid things by giving it to bureaucrats who have no clue, salarymen who have no clue whatsoever. Yeah, so it was...
There you go. So that's the thing. At the beginning of this interview, the head of Central Park Media here said that when discussing distributing anime from Japanese companies in what would probably be 1991 or 1990, especially when we're talking around Akira and stuff like that. I think that's around the era we're talking about, give or take. When he worked with them specifically, they were like, you cannot sell this to American audiences. They will not be interested. When he created his own company, they were like, I guess you can sell it now. We don't really care because you're not actually part of our company anymore. And we think that if it failed, it would be a stain on our reputation. So now that you're a different company and have nothing to do with us, we don't give a shit if you fail, so we'll sell it to you. That is the perspective of Japanese industry, Japanese corporations in 1990 about anime. So this is kind of relevant, I guess, more so to this last video, but he was positing that this is perhaps went back all the way to the 70s in some way about this soft power revolution. But realistically, the government didn't have an interest in this for a really, really long time. And until 2002, it was not on their radar. And even after 2002, the Cool Japan initiative, which starts in 2010, wasn't necessarily too much about anime. Now, we can talk about that because I have another book on me. I have another source. I've got many of them. In Anime A History, 2nd edition, there's a completely new chapter about the failures of Cool Japan and specifically why that failed and how it failed in Japan. In the prior video, Munisa implies that the reason it failed is because it didn't make money, but that wasn't the point. The point of it was to try and use influence. But unfortunately, Cool Japan failed on both money and influence. It was a complete failure because it was run by bureaucrats who didn't know what they were doing, as said by Mr. John here. Key points. I remember there's some really specific points in here that went around how the Japanese government did try and fund several big anime movies to try and sort of reap off, they were thinking things like Spirited Away, right? Spirited Away becoming the biggest anime, biggest Japanese movie of all time, basically, when it comes to income or gross, let's say. They tried to fund 3 or 4 of those projects. Now, none of those projects got made because this project was made by bureaucrats who don't know what they're doing. They threw money at corporations who some of those corporate politicians were friendly with. So this was kind of almost like an embezzling job where a lot of the money that went into the anime industry for Cool Japan ended up being embezzled into big companies who probably just stored it away and didn't actually make any output from it. Like these movies where what happened to the money for all those big budget movies that they were supposed to make? I don't know. They never got made. That money probably disappeared somewhere into someone's foreign bank account. That's the kind of situation we're talking about with Cool Power here. Cool Japan Power is just a complete failure on all levels. He's going to talk about, in a minute, he's going to talk about 2024's revival Cool Japan project, which is going to be probably the same thing again. And there are some initiatives they're trying which seem a bit more realistic, but for the most part, I don't have much faith that a government body actually knows how to sell to a foreign audience, because it's not really that easy. And in the times when the Japanese, even Japanese companies have tried to sell to foreign industries by making their own streaming sites and stuff like that, they have all failed horrifically, like Daisuke. Those series were supposed, they were kind of posited if you want to support the anime industry directly, you can watch it from our streaming service, made in Japan. And it's they'd never survive. It's such a hard industry to break into. Now, it'd be good if one of them maybe survived in some way, but it's not really that easy. To expect a government body to know how to sell something to a foreign audience is actually a lot more complicated than perhaps he would imply throughout these videos. And if I could find the specific quote, there was a very alarming quote in here, which I remember being very good. Is it this one? The Cool Japan money that is killing the Japanese film business, I think this is a book, decried it that being Cool Japan, as a pointless bureaucratic exercise believed by the public to be supporting Japanese creative industries, but actually funneling money into series of ill-advised boondongles and nepotism enterprises and doomed schemes. Almost like it was intentionally built to be failed. Like these people were ripping the government off. Well, there's so many stories you could really pick out there. It's kind of insane. I mean, I remember when we did the stream for this on the Weave Cruise channel, I think it was, one of the people in the comments talked about, I guess they lived in Japan. They mentioned an interview they saw on television when they were asking one of the initiative, like one of the, I guess the government people who run the Cool Japan project, I guess this was probably in the 2010s, like, what has Cool Japan done for anime? And they answered, it made Naruto popular, to which they go, no, Naruto was popular before you even started the project. And they went, oh. And they had nothing. They had nothing. They had no response. They're like, what did Cool Japan do for anime? The answer is jack and shit. The creator of Super Flat, I remember, has a bit in it. Yeah, here it is, Takashi, right? Takashi, this is the last bit, I'll probably read this bit. Takashi said of Cool Japan, little more than an ad copy to allow public funds to go to advertising companies. That's what he felt about Cool Japan as an initiative. And I think that says everything you really need to say about Cool Japan and how it's failing. I mean, a lot of it also went into like cultural stuff that didn't really succeed, like sumo. That's where a lot of money went to, and some stuff like traditional tea ceremonies. Anime was like one part of it, but it wasn't even necessarily the focus of Cool Japan, maybe as much as it should have been. Because maybe, you know, if they had ran it in such a way, there might have been some slam dunks in that they could have got, but they didn't. Maybe like, you know, funding anime is better, or funding the industry. Oh god, something fell off. This is not the kind of stuff. I think the government would be better served in this area, if you want to help with anime, would be in the putting down legislations to tighten regulation, helping getting animators paid more, putting down better laws or better restrictions on, you know, how much overtime they can do, like working in like training. Maybe they could make some sort of like Japanese funded like training bureau for animators if they think that a lot of the newer ones still need work or help, or giving support schemes for like housing, or you know, some way of like protecting them during these sort of really poorly paid era. There's a lot of things they could do to help that industry like long term, which they never end up doing. The book I was reading the quote from is Anime, A History by, I think it's Jonathan Clements, the second edition, which came out a year or two ago. So the second edition of Anime, A History is different than the first edition. The second edition has corrections and new chapters. What I read from was a new chapter from the second edition, which I believe is called The Problems with Cool Japan or something like that. It's towards the end of the book. It's in chapter 12, Holy Lands Otaku Economics, I think is what the book is telling me is the name of this chapter. There's also a chapter on China, our good old friend Mao, apparently, and the development of the both investment within the anime industry and also the development of the Chinese industry to compete and stuff like that. Still doing the animated pilot project. I mean, it's a very minor project. Like it's not really. It's only a training project, as in that it gives funding, a small bit of funding, to a studio that writes up an appeal. It doesn't train them directly. What it basically says is, we will give you this money to make a short movie with this theme, or this vague theme. That's what happens in the project. I don't even know if it runs the same way it used to. What it used to happen is I think it was Janica. Janica would go to the government, and then the government would give Janica the money to run the project, and then Janica would then get different studios to pitch a short to them, and then they would hand pick out like 4 or 5 studios and go, I like that project, I like that project. Janica has nothing to do with the government. They are a guild, I guess, of some sort of labor advocacy group. So I think they have stopped doing that. I think someone else does it now. But it wasn't really, it's training in a very, very like, if you believe training is strictly just making something, it's like you get animators you have in your project, or maybe younger ones, and they get to make a short film, and the government pays money for them to make the short film, but there's no training involved. It's just they make something, and then it gets released through a government body, but most of them don't get broader distribution. I think one of the few examples where that they actually did get broader distribution is the one that Trigger did, the Little Witch Academia, because eventually that became a series, and then they could put that pilot on like the DVD or something. But most of them stay as pilots. But like, it's training. I mean, I don't know if it's a bit hard to call it training. It's just like project. It's basically what most government bodies do in terms of like a lot of government bodies will, in different countries, will like fund some kind of like vague art and animation project to do with something to do with the country sometimes, and the funding will be variant, but like a lot of them, the more avant-garde animators in the Japanese industry may go to Canada and get funding to make some sort of project which will have a vague like theme, like beach, like, and that will be it. Or like there'll be a project that they'll fund in Japan, and the project will be around a specific period in Japanese history, and you just have to make a short film on it. That kind of stuff. It's really just an extension of those kind of projects, but for the anime industry. There are definitely better ways they could have done this. Anyway, I will watch a little bit more. I think there's a couple points he's going to make, and then I'll probably summarize where I'm going with this, because I think there's one more. I don't know if it's in the split. It might be.
Barbaric, like calligraphy, tea ceremonies, and kabuki were exported to the West to soften Japan's image. NHK World, the Japanese state broadcaster, began reaching out to international audiences. Sponsored film festivals.
I mean, again, this is generally
abroad
common, like
Japanese
soft power
movies.
processes that most
Japanese
companies
TV
might do.
dramas were licensed, sometimes even at a financial loss, just to build international goodwill. And domestically, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry cracked down on cheap junk, introducing strict quality standards. Only goods that passed state inspection could bear the stamp "Made in Japan." It wasn't just about producing better products.
I mean, I'm not sure what the source on that is, but I'll have to take it as correct for now.
Soft power
It's fine.
through global marketing,
It's not really the point
a
here.
marriage of government resources and private industry. And yet, in this early phase, Japan's official cultural exports focused on high arts and economic prestige, and not for the most part on mass media.
Yeah, because that
Anime
happens
and
for
manga,
most
still
of the
fringe
period of Japan
subcultures at the
society.
time, were almost totally absent from this
Again,
first
until you
wave.
get to the mid-2000s, that is generally the consistency for its whole career as the Japan Foundation. So it's organization like the Japan Foundation mainly focus on that until like towards the mid to late 2000s. That there is a slight change, but then they don't just focus on anime. They do still focus on the stuff they did before. They just happen to do a bit more anime related stuff on top of that, and manga related stuff like histories of getting and speakers in, stuff like that. It's very like mild, honestly. I don't know. It's not anything crazy.
Of soft power diplomacy. But culture has a way of slipping through the cracks of official policy. And by the 80s and 90s, anime, manga, and video games, once dismissed as niche and lowbrow, were becoming Japan's most beloved global exports. Anime, though, is messy. It's not a no mask or a cherry blossom garden, or for that matter, a dump truck. Anime, as we discussed, can be quite emotional, raw, and at times.
I mean, it depends on the anime, of
vulnerable.
course, as well.
But that same vulnerability,
Like there are definitely some anime
authenticity
that
made it popular.
could make like really
Hugely
easy
popular.
transfers, like Heidi.
Anime was no longer subculture. It was culture. And once the Japanese government realized that anime, manga, and games could succeed abroad where
I mean, it's kind of like it is culture, but it's still niche culture, and the Japanese government only begrudgingly accepted it at a certain point. Like, I don't think they're really happy about it, but they have accepted it because, you know, like for the longest time there was a lot of period where, again, otaku were shit talked, anime was shit talked. It's like, so like, and then there was like specific pockets, like maybe Miyazaki is friendly, so you know that's a thumbs up, but like Evangelion, no. Like, but then Evangelion gets really popular, and it's like, you know, now it's a soft power machine, and there's like tourism places in Arno's like hometown that have some relation to the series to help that old dying industrial town.
traditional exports had failed.
And you know,
it
things change
moved
over time.
to harness that power. And thus, in the early 2000s, Japan's cultural diplomacy pivoted. Rather than just exporting tea ceremonies or cherry blossoms,
I mean, they still do
it would
this,
promote pop culture,
but
anime, J-pop.
ultimately, Japan as a government has failed to promote these things properly. Completely failed. What really pushes anime was the grassroots movement abroad in lots of different countries. Sometimes, you know, other countries with national boards were more helpful towards anime. Someone brought up France in the chat. The reason that is because public broadcasters would show anime on television a lot because it's cheap to import, and it means you don't have to make your own cartoons. That's how it was used. There's a bit of a contentious relationship with it in England, where like we didn't get as much of it because of the controversies that manga video created with things like Overfiend. So like the broadcasters, the national broadcasters at least, were a lot more selective about what they chose to be on television, especially when it came from Japan. Usually they would more so look at things that were like co-productions with Europe, which might be that weird colonist mindset they have, where like the French co-production anime, that stuff gets on television. The Finnish and co-production for like Moomins that gets on public broadcasting, and the massive popularity of Pokemon ends up on like ITV or CITV. BBC kind of ignored anime for like 2 decades, but like their experience with it towards the end of it, from what I remember, was Astro Boy 2003, and then like nothing for a decade plus, until like more so recently, when I think you can now watch Pokemon on iPlayer. I don't really watch it on this, so I don't know. I think they did a dub for the Dragon Quest anime, the newer one from the BBC. Just like some weird stuff like that. They pick up a couple of random things now, but like it was like 20 years of complete, like, they don't care. And then suddenly out of nowhere with the streaming wars, they were like, okay, now we care. Mainly because I think ITV was picking up a bunch of anime. They're like, hey, we can't be left behind. There's a lot of places that liked anime outside of, obviously, like America or England. Italy, France, the Middle East. Again, the Middle East made a deal with Japan during the 70s because they didn't have the funding to make, a lot of the Gulf state didn't have the funding to do their own animated cartoon blocks, so they would take cartoon blocks from Japan. And a lot of those shows, I remember when I went to the manga museum, there was a museum in London several years back. One of the things they were bigged up was that Captain Tsubasa was massive in the Middle East and Egypt. And one of the factors of that was, I believe, that it was one of the shows that Japan Foundation actually, I think, helped give funding to those bodies to get it localized. They weren't involved in the localization, but they kind of like would just give them money, like a grant, and be like, here you go, here's some money to localize these cartoons. That kind of thing. But there were like several cartoons. I think maybe Future Boy Conan, I think, got there, but also Conan the Detective, that's big in the Middle East. A lot of different shows. And obviously Saudi Arabia is massive on anime, and even doing their own co-productions now. And the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia is like a weird 90s anime kid who bought SNK just so he could get Obari to do the opening animations for King of Fighters games and relive his childhood of watching Fatal Fury, the OVA movie thing. So yeah, and Grandizer recently. But yeah, we'll get back to
street fashion really and video games as national brand assets, as cultural ambassadors for the nation.
Yeah, I mean, Wallace and Gromit is a cultural ambassador for England, right? This is how it goes.
To cool Japan. In 2010, the Japanese government, under the direction of the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, or METI, started the Cool Japan initiative. The goal was simple: promote Japanese pop culture internationally through subsidies.
Now, I've already gave you a breakdown of the problems with Cool Japan, so how does Mooney present that to our audience?
Than it yields in return. Programs and subsidies provided with the express and stated purpose of increasing Japanese soft power, such as JLOP, the Japan Content Localization and Promotion Support Fund, launched, subsidizing localization and
I think generally these kind of projects are a good thing if you want to get more localized or translated games out there.
Funding not just translations, but international pop culture events. JLOX replaced JLOP Plus with a stronger focus on digital distribution, putting anime on streaming platforms, expanding marketing abroad, and preserving Japan's cultural competitiveness against rising challengers. This list, of course, is not exhaustive. The push didn't just stop at streaming rights and merchandise. In 2016, for example, the Japanese government helped launch the Anime Tourism Association, a public-private partnership whose goal was to map real-world locations tied to anime series and turn them into formal tourist destinations.
I mean, the thing is, I'm sure they did this right, and I'm sure I understand the logic of them doing this, but like otaku pilgrimages have existed for decades. So like what has happened is the government has registered that something has been happening for a really long time. I mean, even now, there was a lot of stories of, let's talk about Bocchi the Rock, right? When Bocchi the Rock came out, there was a huge increase in people going to a location that is in the anime, the stairs down to the bar in like the basement. That is a real place in Japan, and a bunch of people coming there, and they had to put up a sign and being like, don't take selfies in front of the stairs because people need to come in. But like that happens, right? People see an area like Akihabara is in many anime in the 2000s, and there are locations that like fans will visit. This is like, it is a classic kind of like approach to some of this, using local destinations as part of the anime. When those destinations start to get an influx of people, because it's basically the most promotion some of those areas may ever have had. Happens in England too. Like there are shows that are shot in certain places in England, and then like some of the more obscure places, and then like fans of those shows come to those areas of England to like check it out and like take pictures and fucking go to the day. And it brings like money into those areas. Like there's reasons that like shows do this sort of stuff. It's not like malicious necessarily.
Otaku, with anime merchandise gift shops finding their ways even into train stations.
I mean, that's
Anime
just,
wasn't
yeah, suffering
media
from success,
anymore.
right?
It became physical infrastructure, emotional engagement, became real-world economic policy. Why does Netflix have so much anime? Well, it's not just consumer demand, it's also the result of years of Japanese government efforts and subsidies.
Yeah,
building
no, it's not, though.
international-
No, it's because I don't think Netflix is the one getting the JLOP subsidies. I think we need to be important. Netflix doesn't need subsidies to get anime. Netflix has been focusing on anime for a really long time, and it is certainly because the numbers do represent it. I mean, we know from like Q4 of 2024, I brought this up in the last stream, Q4 2024, 300 million watch hours from One Piece, from, God, what were the other two? It was like One Piece, what were the other ones that got really big ones? I think Dragon Ball was up there, but I don't know if it was as big. And then Pokemon was up there, and probably Demon Slayer. Like, these all had hundreds and hundreds of millions of watch hours for a quarter of a year internationally, and other stories like Dan and Jujutsu Kaisen, and Attack on Titan and JoJo were probably fairly high up. I don't think they were in the top 10 though. There's a lot of different series that have massive numbers on these services, and they know it. And when it comes to streaming in Japan, Netflix is really the only one that I think has picked up a good. I think they kind of became the go-to place for anime in Japan to watch it as time has gone on, and you can see that like a lot of the most watched things on in Netflix Japan tend to be anime related. It's like that and Harry Potter. So yeah, I think that Netflix is a billion-dollar private company that does not need your subsidies. I don't know if they have many uses for them. There are other companies who probably are much more need of it than Netflix. I don't even know if Netflix is using any of them. But I don't think the government's attempts and failed attempts of giving their friends money had much to do with Netflix's position on this.
Ecosystem where anime could flourish abroad, even as those
And
subsidies
it was already
produced a net
flourishing abroad.
economic loss for Japan. This video might not be brought to you by
Yes.
Crunchyroll.
Hunter
but
x Hunter
Crunchyroll
was
is brought to you by
Hunter x Hunter
subsidies.
was also
Not
really big
direct
on
funding
on
mind you,
Netflix.
but through the deliberate expansion of an ecosystem designed to make anime a global force. Don't take my word for it. Here's a report from the Japanese Prime Minister's office, specifically from the Intellectual Property Strategy HQ dated June 4th, 2024.
Yeah, so this
I've
is them
linked it in
trying to
the
resurrect New
description so that you can
Cool
read
Japan.
the whole thing, but nothing I've discussed here is hidden. There's no need to refute what the Japanese government happily tells you outright. Consider, and I quote, in developing demand for content and other cool Japan-related fields, it is important to
When it
ensure
comes to
appro-
this stuff, though, what they're saying in this quote here is not really that crazy. I might be in the way now on the screen. Maybe I'm going to have to move myself. Maybe I'll read it out for him. In developing demands of content for other Cool Japan-related fields, it is important to ensure appropriate distribution channels. For instance, subscription business models for video and music distribution becoming mainstream is a content field. Global content distribution channels are becoming increasingly important, but distribution channels are heavily dependent on major overseas operators without their global distribution channels, making it difficult for the strategy to cultivate overseas demands based on their own judgment. In the future, it will become more important to create their our own distribution channels to secure slots, which in theory is a perfectly logical perspective that Japan takes on this. This is a response to platformer colonization. I think it's called is it called platformer imperialism? Platform imperialism? I think that's the name of it, where like you are at the whims of massive companies in foreign countries for what they will and won't take, how they'll take that, what they'll do with it. There's a lot of like positions where these companies hold a lot of position over you, how you can present your media, what it ends up looking like, where it's presented on those websites, and like one little change could ruin your whole entire business model to some degree. You know, like a lot of these websites in England don't even have an anime section. They don't have a, like, you know, when it comes to genres, they don't even have one. It's just like they're thrown in the recesses of these websites, because these websites still don't really care about anime, but they probably care about it just enough to be like, well, we don't want the other British services, like local channel services, to have them, so we're going to take them, but we're not going to give them a special place. They're not even going to be tagged for animation. They'll end up in the drama section or something. Well, like, that really limits their position to be found. I mean, giving the money to the animators directly would be a good idea. They probably won't do that, though. Yeah, but this is the idea of also, here's another example of platformer imperialism. My friend was reading through the Chainsaw Man manga on the Shonen Jump app. They bought the Shonen Jump app. it's like, what, £2 a month or something like that. And they were reading through the Chainsaw Man manga. She's a big fan of Chainsaw Man. They came to a chapter where the app itself was like, sorry, we cannot show you this chapter of the manga. We're not allowed to. And it's like, why are you not allowed to? It's like, well, there are some countries that we distribute in that think this stuff is like illegal, because that episode had overt sexual themes and lesbianism. And those countries decided, like, no, we refuse to have that on our platform. And because these platforms are made in a broader sense, basically means that chapter was not allowed on any version of the Shonen Jump app. So what happened is she had to then go to the fucking Viz website and then read the chapter on the Viz website somehow in some weird, awkward, gonky third party, like, find the website, log in through there using and get some link to it or some shit like that. And it's just like, what the fuck is going on? That is platform imperialism. That is a position where, like, that is, I guess, some form of it, I would say. I mean, maybe that's a Japanese app, so maybe that's slightly different than like a foreign app having those issues, but it is an issue with these broader context systems and how they work within platforms and how they're affected by all these other factors beyond just the creativity of itself. Another example might be Amazon. A friend of mine back in my hometown, their mother, recreationally, is a smut writer. They write these, like, smutty novels in their spare time. And I remember this is years ago. They were saying that Amazon changed its rules about how you could title books and how explicit the titles could be. And a lot of people in that field, even though they were more of a hobbyist, were quite annoyed about that because they relied on having a specific type of title format, which now was not allowed anymore. And that could massively fuck up your business, because now you have to change everything. It's like, that's the kind of thing that a platform imperialism is affected by, where, like, a random company can make a decision that can completely destroy you as a party within that ecosphere. But yeah, that is an example of, I think they start saying this as I think Mooney starts using a different term, which I don't think is related, but we'll get to that in a bit.
Appropriate distribution channels. For instance, with subscription business models for video and music distribution becoming mainstream in the content field, global content.
I mean, Japan did try and make its own music streaming during the PlayStation 4 era, and it failed completely.
Are heavily dependent on major overseas operators.
Oh, he's going to just do the quote I just said. Okay, maybe I'll skip this bit then.
Overseas.
Yeah, I think he applies.
Or other. That's a video for another day.
Techno-feudalism, which I don't know if that's really as relevant as what I'm talking about here.
Moving on, to ensure these domestic and international distribution channels, Cool Japan Fund Incorporated has been investing in various platform projects. Specifically, investments have been made in locations such as retail outlets, digital platforms, and wholesale supply chains to serve as bridgeheads for domestic.
I mean, these are probably good ideas on paper, but I think the problem with the Cool Japan initiative is to say, yeah, these ideas in theory could be good, but I don't think that means there is a difference between intent and execution, right? So, like, well, these ideas are like, yeah, okay, that makes sense to some degree. They tried this last time, and some of the ways they failed were, like, kind of amazing. I don't know. I don't want to spend ages reading that chapter, but that chapter is so alarming about how fucked Cool Japan was on so many different levels. It's almost impressive how much they fucked it up and how confusing it was, even when it came to, like, them trying to sell things in international stores or something like that.
Businesses to cultivate demand from local consumers overseas. These efforts have contributed to the branding and demand development of local products in Europe and the development of demand for Japanese sake in China, resulting in a ripple effect,
Generally, food and drink is probably the most affected part of Japan's soft power, which is what they say in the report.
38 for a second. It states,
in their mind.
Instance, Sony Group Incorporated acquired Crunchyroll, an American animation distribution platform, in 2021.
I mean, yes, they did, but it was the American branch. I'm pretty sure that technically owns it, but I guess it's part of now the broader company. But it's the people who used to run Funimation who now run Crunchyroll and are doing, I mean, a fucking terrible job, really. But, like, I think the prior Crunchyroll staff were also doing a terrible job. So, like, Crunchyroll is kind of like this compromised creature that's, not good for the industry in a lot of ways, and also really hurts translations because of the terrible slave wages they give them, which did not get fixed after they were merged with Funimation. It got worse. So, like, I think a world without Crunchyroll would probably be a better one, even for the industry. Even if they own it now, I don't think it's benefiting the actual people that matter in this context, the animators.
Indicating that some of them are making efforts through their own distribution channels. Let's conclude our discussion of this document with a final snippet, and I quote, Although Cool Japan Incorporated has issues to improve in terms of profitability, as mentioned above, it is further critical to create
It's not
and
just
secure
profitability, it's
global
just complete
distribution
failure.
channels while achieving leverage through investments in other means. It is necessary to take steps to maximize policy effects, including cooperation with related institutions, while monitoring the progress of the organization's achievement of its policy and profitability.
I'm sorry, but the way he reads this with the implication, because look, if you've seen the other video, his conclusion kind of came down to something along the lines of Japan is trying to brainwash people overseas, kind of maybe by using their soft power to make you forget about their war crimes, which is a very questionably sourced argument that doesn't make a lot of sense in a lot of ways, and reads like Yellow Peril in a lot of ways. Life is far more complicated than that, and Japan's attempts of soft power, while there's an intent there, usually has been a complete failure on their own personal basis of doing it. But their policy goals are most likely, including he's about to show a diagram, the policy goals seem to be tourism, make more money, more influence, sell more things, more prestige. That tends to be what they seem to imply of their policy goals, at least. But also, Japan's policy goals are America's policy goals. I think the problem with trying to stoke fear into this like imperialist Japan revival is that Japan is the dog of American imperialism. In fact, an article came out today, which I will reference on the stream, and I was going to bring up because I think this really, really bluntly explains how that works. Today, there was an article that came out about Iran, and it was talking about banning of nuclear weapons, which was a call by some UN members, but Japan won't join the UN meeting about this because, as they say, nuclear weapons are really important for their policies politically because of the US deterrence, in that they are, quote, protected in their mind by the United States, even if they don't trust the United States will truly protect them 100%, which they've been more scared of as the years went by, especially after some of the events recently where they've definitely upped money in defense because I think it was fears around Ukraine and them defunding Ukraine, being like, shit, I can't really rely on America to protect us if anything went down. Though unlikely it would, to be fair. But I think the fear lives in their hearts. But it says, Japan will not attend the US conference for the Treaty of Banning Nuclear Weapons. The top government official from Tokyo said on Monday, noting US nuclear deterrence is crucial to the country's security, and participation of this would send the wrong message. Who is it sending the wrong message to? America. America controls Japan's foreign policy. America controls a lot of decisions that Japan will make. So this idea that there's some sort of special goal that that only Japan has, I don't know, I don't really buy it in that same way. I think they obviously have goals, they have interests, and they would love to have that sort of magical intent created by these series. It's just that the government has no way of actually knowing how to operate these things properly. It's the private companies that seem to be the ones succeeding in some regard, even if it's not even by their hands sometimes, it's by the community's hands. But yeah, I think that is I think it's worth bringing up in terms of these contexts about what truly are those policy goals.
Take note of the wording like a lawyer does, right? Policy and profitability goals are separated. They are different. Profit is secondary. Policy effects, quote unquote.
Yeah, I mean, profitability and government goals are different things.
What policy effects do they mean?
But there are no.
There's a helpful diagram included for us that states in no.
Okay, well, let's have a look at this diagram. Basically, this diagram says that food is the most important circle of this, and it has multiple forms of it. And it was kind of what I was describing before. Stuff about culture, tourism, profits for companies, more prestige for Japan, or more knowledge, more soft power. It seems fairly standard for a soft power project.
What the Japanese government wants to maximize. Page 22.
Maybe he'll put a zoom in here, that might make it easy. There we go.
Japan's.
Yeah. Increasing overseas development, increasing exports, as it says here, agriculture, forestry, and Japanese food is the biggest driving force of these factors, increasing the number of foreign visitors. Yeah, it's a pretty simple diagram of like intent, which I don't know if the government actually can really do anything to change, but the industries are going up despite the government. So at least with the anime industry, you can see the numbers still are ticking up, I suppose. I mean, that can't happen forever, but you know.
Brand, in quotations, soft power. In my last video, I had quite a few people stating that the whole soft power thing was ridiculous. Please then, get your eyes off the cave wall and look at the exact words of the...
It's not that the soft power thing was ridiculous, it's about the intent of saying the government was able to do all this, or that the government controls the anime industry, where it's like simply those things are just delusions, those aren't true, and the failures of soft power projects like Cool Japan were massive on all levels. They did not succeed at any of their goals. So that's, I think, what... maybe there were some people who were just in complete denial, but like, it's not that the government isn't trying to do these things, it's that they fail at these things, that they suck at these things, that they don't know what they're doing with these things, that they are completely detached from these things. That is more the concern. So when we try and put some sort of intent on what they're doing, it feels a little conspiratorial.
Japanese government. The foremost policy goal of pushing...
That doesn't mean the government is good in Japan. The government in Japan kind of sucks for a lot of different reasons, right? But I don't think they are masterminds. I think they're just incredibly incompetent.
Anime was, is, and remains soft power. Herein, though, lies a problem. Coolness, true cultural resonance, doesn't come from bureaucrats or policy papers. Anime, manga, and games initially succeeded abroad not because they were polished products of national branding, but precisely because they were so messy and real. They carried vulnerability and realness, and people around the world related to that even if they couldn't put it into words. Anime and its peripherals became an effective tool.
I mean, Nausicaa, I love Nausicaa, but Nausicaa's quite commercial as far as these things go. I mean, it was made by a production company, right? I could see Nausicaa being a B-movie American live-action film with lots of shitty puppets and props from the mid-80s. Like, they could have made that on VHS or as like a Star Wars rip-off kind of thing. Like, it didn't. If it wasn't animated, I could totally see that film existing in the American context within like 1985. It'd be like Princess Saria and her magical journey, and it's like they shoot in a fucking swamp woods. They have some big fucking puppets of like the Olm, and occasionally they fly on like a blue screen with one of these devices. Like that totally could have existed within that Japanese within the American context of like cheap B-movie sci-fi films from the 80s. They could have totally done that, and like I feel like for the most part the film would have probably, some parts might have changed, but like I feel like that's probably not the exact one we would be talking about on that.
Japan was widely criticized, domestically and internationally, for being clunky, inefficient, wasteful, and fundamentally missing the point.
But it failed.
Once again, that critics who see only the economic side of the equation are themselves missing the bigger picture.
But again, like, this is the thing I'm saying. Mooney, he's completely failing to register that, no, it's not just that, like, yeah, it didn't make its money back. It failed on all accounts. It wasn't able to do any of its goals. It wasn't just that, like, it threw a bunch of money in the projects and, like, it didn't see a return on those projects. It was just that it failed on every account. It failed on helping the industry. It failed on promoting the industry. It failed in magical ways that usually came with embezzling money, as we can see here, with the $80 million going into high-profile anime movies that never got made. It's astounding how it failed. It isn't just, like, this implication here is, like, it actually succeeded, even though it said it failed. But that's the impression I get from what he's saying here.
Sure. And while these critics might not be paying close enough
not
attention
true.
to the details,
You're not paying close enough attention. That's what I'm saying.
Other nations were taking notes on Japan's cultural rise. They had seen the power of God and anime, and soon they would use the lessons Japan learned.
It did succeed at making some politicians' friends rich,
building
yes.
a foundation for their own soft power and capturing hearts and minds as they went.
So I think this is now the section. We might be done. We might be done. I might be done here because this is when he gets back to the Gacha thing, and I don't think there's much more I could. I'm getting incredibly warm, and it's getting late. Maybe I'll summarize my points here. This is back when this is now the Gacha side of the video. This is a different video about Gacha and shit, and other stuff. Does he realize that? Oh, okay. Actually, I don't know if I've seen this bit. All right, let me just broadly curious about what he's about to say city pop, because last time he made a video talking about city pop, he tried to imply it. The way he said it sounded like he thought that city pop hit America in the 80s, which is absolutely not true. That couldn't have happened. Like, the Japanese only music did not hit America in big hits in the 1980s. That, unless you're talking about like what, Yellow Magic Orchestra, a couple of songs of theirs. City pop did not hit America in the 80s. It hit Brazil in certain parts of the 80s because of their enclaves who brought the tapes back from Japan to Brazil, and it hit the West broadly in the 2000s when those CDs were reprinted and some Americans got their hold of it and put them on the internet. But like before that point, it's
It was
nothing.
disco, reimagined for a country inventing its own version of the future, a future it had worked half a century
what's he gonna say right
to
now?
forge. Artists like Junko Ohashi, Miki Matsubara, Anri, and Maria Takeuchi took disco and adapted it and refined it into something uniquely Japanese.
More than disco, but okay.
Glossy yet nostalgic, cosmopolitan, and yet underneath all of the glamour, also quietly vulnerable. Throughout the 1980s and into the early 1990s, city pop and the
okay.
consumer culture it celebrated, the luxury cars, the fashionable gadgets, the glitzy urban life,
What's this
helped
got to do with
define
Gacha?
Japan's international image, futuristic, clean, and desirable.
Again, like, the people in the Americas and foreign countries didn't even know what a city pop was. So, like, I don't know if it really helped much of that. I mean, there was a broader image of the futuristic city of Japan, which was created by journalists in America and Britain in the 70s. But, like, that's a different thing.
Through music, fashion, and lifestyle exports, Japan was selling not just products, but a feeling, a vibe, a Japanese
To
dream
who?
that maybe other countries might just want
I mean,
to
if you're
buy.
talking about, like, TVs, speakers, cars, they were selling those, yeah. We're not selling music internationally. Not to America.
Into. It was a bubble of prosperity that had
Not
reached
like
untold heights, and yet
many
no
products.
bubble lasts forever.
I don't think Sake
I
was
won't
making
get
it to
too
America
deep
too
into
much in
the
the 80s.
Plaza Accord. The 1985 agreement between the U.S. and other powers meant to weaken the dollar, which crippled Japan. Or
I can't get into that today because that is a economic conversation that would be very long lasting and complicated. I don't know what this. I'm sorry, fellas. Does anyone know what this has to do with gacha games? Maybe they'll get there eventually, but I don't know if I have. I think that's enough. I mean, we went through probably a good portion of this video. Again, I said I'm not going to talk about the gacha game stuff today because that's a completely different field of research and topics and getting into the minutiae of the gacha games. That's too much for me today, and it's not my field. Like I'm talking about the parts that I know. I know Miyazaki. I know Japanese history. I know a lot of these areas well enough. Well enough. I've read a fair couple of books on these pages, and not just Wikipedia articles. Yeah, we could just say like, well, yeah, I mean, Japanese soft power is successful. Korean soft power is successful in music, but not in animation. And Chinese soft power is successful in Asia, but perhaps not in its enemies, like America, enemy, and Europe. But maybe one day they hope it will be, in the same way with Japan. And to do that, they took the mirror image of those that were already popular to try and, I don't know if the word's even confused, but like, you like this stuff, consumer. This is also like that stuff, but it's from a different country. But, it's close enough that you probably won't tell the difference in like the glancing of first checking it out. Yeah, I mean, this is what I'm saying. That's why I said it doesn't really matter if I move around, because there's like chapters to this video, but like we're jumping between radically different topics. And I tried to jump to the parts of the topics that I thought were relevant to the conversations I wanted to have about, anime history, soft power, these specific figures, and also back to this conversation that connected to that last video that Mooney made. The rest of this video, I think, is about gacha games and stuff. I think is actually, well, this isn't even about that. It's about music. I mean, there are a lot of areas where Japanese soft power has kind of failed. Broadly, live action Japanese products don't do well. Tokusatsu has it like its niche, but Japanese live action movie, maybe for the art house crew, but they don't do anywhere as well as anime movies do broadly. Japanese music again has its pockets and like Vocaloid stuff and some J-pop, but it's such a failure in comparison to K-pop. It's unreal. The last time Japan had a particularly high rated song on iTunes or something that wasn't from Hololive's American members. Maybe some of the Japanese members got high on iTunes nowadays. Like if we get beyond that kind of element there, it's going to be something like Hatsune Miku in 2007. And maybe Kiri Pamu Pamu might have done well at one point on iTunes, maybe like in the American iTunes. It's like these small pockets, these small tiny little pockets. It just doesn't compare, and that's the thing. Like it's an inconsistent soft power because of where it's not came from any broader coalition to push it. It came from these sort of grassroots movements of different places that have gained an interest in certain things. yes, Japanese games are definitely one of the more popular things, but that had nothing to do, obviously, with the government. And the popularity of those definitely probably relies on Nintendo. And then what Nintendo did, which was create a American branch, and then use that to help them promote their titles within, America. And the same with Sega, right? Sega had Sega of America, so they instantly registered that like they can't do it themselves. They need an American company or like people from the American side to help them sell these things in foreign countries, and like trust them to some degree in how they will approach that. They've been there, there's sort of touch and go with that. Yes, Nintendo definitely, Sega definitely had their periods. They were probably, video games in Japan are, as a broader soft power machine, video games are probably the most popular thing to come out of Japan. They definitely, I think, jump over anime in how much they make and how much they can sell and stuff like that. Like, you look at something like Mario, right? Well, Mario's like 80 million, 100 million worldwide copies sold or something like crazy like that. You look at many of those series, like Legend of Zelda, the newest ones, both have sold like 30 million copies. That's fucking crazy. You're not going to hear a story about like a random anime that sold 30 million copies. It's just, I've never heard it myself. Maybe there is one, but I fucking haven't heard it. It's like, maybe like broadly over like decades, there's some anime that's done that, but it hasn't been like said broadly to the public. So yeah, to wrap up some of this, some of this does relate back to the Moon Channel's original video on this topic. Some of this is like a little course corrections. Other bits are less read up on, like when we went through the otaku sections, being a couple of like both one fake Miyazaki quote and one that was cropped out of context, and I don't know if that translation was exactly the same as the one I had from the direct website. I would have to look at it more intentionally, but when you remove a lot of the context from the quote, it kind of... Well, Miyazaki is saying one thing, and it's similar to some of the things he's saying. I don't think you should take Miyazaki's opinion on that too seriously. He's just one dude, and a dude who's not particularly that informed on the topic, and who also shit talks all the time. But if we're going to talk about Miyazaki's perspective on it, at least can we use real quotes? Or quotes where you know where it's from, or like the context of what he was talking about is? My lord. To me, that's a small bar to take over.